The emperor looked closely at the young lady and said with a grin that he was giving her the right to choose her husband. He said with a smirk that he was giving it to her as a reward for winning. The young lady froze in shock on the spot because she expected something else. The emperor said that by his command, whoever she wished, he would enter into a marriage alliance with her. Everyone present began to whisper, because they did not know who would have to marry the ragamuffin. She was shocked, because she understood that the price for a lifelong bloody battle was the right to choose a spouse. The young lady stood frozen in shock and rage. The great warrior, Amir Pervaz, Heroes of Empires, who 30 years ago, at a critical moment, saved the crown prince. Out of shame and envy, the crown prince led the hero north to destroy the Lur tribe. He bowed his head and looked sideways at the prince with fury, but still agreed. A faithful knight went to the battlefield, even knowing about mortal danger. That was her father. Pervaz territory abandoned by the empire. In those lands, carelessly abandoned, without any support, her father fought fiercely against the enemies. Unfortunately, he died in the war, and after his death, her older brother entered the battle. As time went by, another brother of hers went into battle. When they fell in battle, a young lady took their place. The young lady, in turn, did not spare herself, but continued the bloody battle. Over time, she managed to end the war. Aisha with lightning speed, and shouted that they had won and ended the war. A moment later, everyone was shouting with joy. Even though the war was over, the joy of victory would not last forever. Aisha knew that the people here could die of hunger before the end of winter. Sometime later, they returned to Pervaz Castle. Decker asked the young lady if it was true that they would receive a reward from the imperial family. He knew that their lands were sovereign, so the emperor didn't care about this place. Aisha told her subordinate to look at the emperor's decree. Leading promised to reward them if they expelled the tribe. Decker was a little puzzled and didn't know if the monarch would keep his promise. Aisha sighed heavily and said that they had no choice. She was furious, and she knew that if they didn't try their luck, everyone in the castle would die of starvation. She mentally prepared herself that it would not be easy to receive the reward, because the ruler of the one who pushed her father to death would not shower her with rich gifts. The emperor asked with a grin if her father had fallen on the battlefield. He sighed and said that it was very unfortunate. The emperor said that since all her older brothers had already died, she inherited the title of Margrave Pervaz as a woman. She looked at the emperor intently and said that everything was correct. The emperor said with a grin that he didn't even know this, and therefore decided that a princess from a barbarian tribe had come to the reception. A moment later, everyone present began to say that she was a barbarian princess. Aisha was furious, but she knew she didn't care how she was insulted. She had to get the money so that the people on her lands could survive. The emperor asked how old she was. Bowing, she said that she was 22 years old. He said that it was time for her to make her debut, and also asked if she hadn't been proposed to yet. Aisha said that it was true. She was puzzled, because she did not understand why he suddenly started talking about such a thing. He said with a grin that he had a great idea. The emperor, with a fierce grin, said that he would grant her the right to choose a spouse as a reward for her victory. The young lady, in turn, froze in place from the juice, as she did not expect this at all. She did not understand what he was talking about at all. A moment later, she was handed a list of aristocrats, and the emperor said that she could choose any man. He said with a grin that the closer to the top of the list, the higher the rank of the applicant, so she should take a closer look at them. She told the emperor that the young man might not want to marry her, and then they would both be in a difficult situation. The emperor said that if he disobeyed, his family would be handed over to the imperial treasury, and the compensation would be given to her. The young lady was shocked by the statement. She was furious because she knew he had come up with a vile plan to avoid giving her the reward she deserved. Looking around carefully, she realized that there were no parents who would voluntarily give their son to a woman who looked like a savage. By the will of the monarch, the family will have to pay a ransom. She said that she chooses you as husbands for the Duke of Carlisle Haven. Carlisle Haven Evaristo, the deposed crown prince. Unfortunately, he was deposed a few days ago due to an unfortunate incident. He was no longer considered a member of the imperial family. Aisha said that as the emperor had previously reported, the one whose name was written at the top of the list was the most influential nobleman among the nobility. The emperor was furious, and in a way he had not expected. Everyone was shocked, because they knew that due to the conflict with his father, he was deprived of the title of heir. But he was called the bloody god of war. Looking at the emperor, she said that if he refused, according to the imperial decree, the family must pay compensation. Everyone understood that if she demanded compensation from the emperor, she would receive the appointed reward. They understood that the emperor had dug his own grave with his own hands, because he had hinted to take a closer look at people of high rank. The emperor, in turn, looked at the young lady with cold fury, but did not have time to say anything. A moment later, the young man burst into wild laughter. The emperor looked at the lady intently and said that he was giving her another chance to think. She said with confidence that the only person she could see as her husband was the duke. She said that if he gave her a reward for winning, she would give up her choice. The duke stood up and said that she didn't have to do that. The duke asked with a smile if she was trying to make a fool of the emperor, since the emperor's word could not be taken back. He said with a smirk that the fact that he, the ruler's eldest son, would marry a border lord was simply unthinkable. He said he couldn't allow his father's promises to be taken as a joke. He looked intently at the young lady and called her. A moment later, the duke said with a grin that he accepted her offer. The young lady, in turn, froze in shock on the spot, as she did not expect such a thing. She did not understand why he said such a thing. She was furious because she wanted money, not a husband. He looked at her with a smile and said that she should take care of him, calling her his wife. The young lady froze in place from the juice as she expected to receive money. Sometime later, the duke sat in the palace reception room, quietly sipping tea. A moment later, a young lady entered the reception room and informed the duke that she had heard him calling her. He looked at her with a smile and said that it seemed that his wife, the brave Margrave Pervaz, had arrived. She looked closely at the prince, as he had a calm expression on his face. She was puzzled, because she realized that she simply could not understand what he was thinking about now. A moment later, she bowed and greeted the duke politely, addressing him as the crown prince. Aisha was momentarily taken aback, as she realized that he was no longer the heir, and that she had to name him duke. He asked her with a grin if she knew why he had lost his status as crown prince. The young lady froze for a moment, not knowing what to answer. After arriving in the capital, she heard that he desired his father's concubine. She sighed heavily, because she understood that people were simply lucky in the capital because they had time to look at other people's women. Then she read in the newspaper that the crown prince had been stripped of his title. Then she could not imagine that the man from the newspaper article would become her husband. He said that if she didn't know, then it didn't make any difference, and she would have to accept it. The young lady froze for a moment in shock. He sighed heavily and asked if she would continue to look at him silently. The duke said with a grin that his appearance must have impressed her greatly. Aisha said that it was not so. She was just jealous of his physique. The duke froze in shock, as he had not expected to hear anything like that. She said that there is a downside to this, because the larger the body, the easier it is to become a target. But he also has physical strength. He sighed heavily and asked if she was really talking about the battlefield now. She said that it was true. Aisha said she would like to have a body like hers, but it is almost impossible. He looked at her intently, as this was a very interesting reaction. A moment later, the duke said they could move on to discussing their deal. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He sighed heavily and asked if she thought he accepted her proposal because he fell in love with her. She wondered if he had a hidden agenda. He noticed that his words pleased her. The duke said that at the time of his overthrow, his father had set a condition. He said that if he repented of his arrogance by serving the empire for a few years, he would regain the title of crown prince. The duke said that for this reason he was going to help her lands, which were exhausted due to the war. She was a little surprised and asked what would happen after this period. The duke said calmly that after that they would divorce. Aisha was surprised, but at the same time happy about this. Carlyle said that she shouldn't care what he does during these years. Carlyle looked at her menacingly and told her that she shouldn't expect him to treat her like a wife. He said that she should not resist him, and if she would accept these conditions, he would spare no gold for the prosperity of her lands. She asked what he wanted to do in her lands, because if it would somehow harm her land, then she could not give her consent. He asked mockingly what she would do in that case. He wanted to know if she could really die of hunger along with the inhabitants. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it was not in his interests to harm Pervaz. She must help him succeed. The young lady considered his words for a while, but finally agreed. She looked at him intently and said that then they should draw up a contract. The Duke was surprised that she would suggest something like that. Aisha said that since he said he would not skimp on help, she would like to sign a contract where this would be stated. He looked at her with a smirk and said that she didn't seem to believe in their empty promises, and he liked that. The Duke said with a grin that they would make a great couple. She said they were a contractual couple who would take what they needed from each other and part ways peacefully. He looked at her with a grin and said that it seemed like they understood each other perfectly. Lionel studied the contract carefully, as everything was written out in detail. The Duke said with a grin that the lady would suffer no loss wherever she went. Lionel asked the Duke in surprise if he was really going to marry a savage from the north. The Duke said it was only for a few years, and asked when he would have such an opportunity. Lionel froze for a moment at his words. The Duke said with a grin that he had been given the opportunity to get rid of the worthless people who dared to covet his place. At the age of 15, the young prince was sent to the battlefield, because after the death of his mother, the stepmother, who became the empress, longed for his death. He fought for a long time and still managed to survive. In turn, he wondered if this was due to God's blessing received at birth. Entire songs and ballads were composed about his exploits. When he returned back to the capital, everyone glorified his name with admiration and greeted him. The empress, in turn, looked at the prince in shock, as she did not expect to see him. Prince Matthias was also frightened. The empress understood perfectly well that she needed to come up with a plan to make her son the crown prince. Sometime later, the emperor's young concubine, trembling in his arms, said that the crown prince had climbed into her room in the middle of the night while she was sleeping. The prince was furious. He shouted that he didn't know that woman was in the room. He said that someone had set it all up and set him up. The emperor was furious and shouted at his son that his arrogance had gone too far, because he had coveted his woman. Then the emperor, out of anger, stripped his son of the title of crown prince. Now he understood that the empress's strategy was to get rid of several annoying things at once. Lionel said that it was all because of Mr. Matthias, although temporarily, but they would treat him like an heir. The Duke understood that the empress would prevent him from restoring his title. A moment later, he said with a grin that the imperial throne was his, and he would kill everyone. He knew he had to build up his forces, where the empress's hand could not reach. Lionel said they could do it in sovereign lands. Lionel knew perfectly well that they could not know what the heiress of the north was like. The Duke sighed heavily and said that this was not the first time they had met. The young man was surprised. The Duke said with a grin that he had encountered her before. A few days ago, the Duke was wandering around the capital. He was furious because he had recently been stripped of his title as heir. He knew that the empress had tricked him. He knew he had been careless, for his mistake had been haste when the new spy had sent a message asking to meet. He thought that at worst you would try to kill him, but then he was stripped of his title. He had already spread rumors that he was very depressed about what had happened because of his press chambers, and therefore wanted to take advantage of the opportunity and get down to business. A moment later, he froze for a moment as the bandits turned to him. He slowly turned around and looked at them intently, preparing for battle. The men surrounded the young man with lightning speed because they wanted to rob him. The Duke was very angry because he understood that as soon as he hid his identity, the bandits immediately appeared. He knew he couldn't do without a fight, but a moment later he heard someone's voice. The man was furious because his robbery had been foiled. Aisha looked at them with cold fury and said that they could even out the numbers, so they would join them. The men shouted angrily that she seemed to have gone crazy and should leave, but the young lady ran up to the gang leader with lightning speed and struck him with fury. A moment later, he fell to the ground with a thud. The men were scared as their boss was beaten. A moment later, she lifted him from the ground and struck him again with fury. The Duke froze in shock as he saw the confident pose and wondered if the girl was a warrior. The man shouted at his accomplice to get up and finish her off. Decker grabbed the man and said that if he was going to attack, he should have done it himself. Decker asked the lady if he should kill the man. She sighed heavily and said that she thought it would be better for them. The Duke looked at them closely as he realized that the girl did not throw herself like the wind. He looked closely at the young men, as he realized that they were accustomed to shedding the blood of people. Decker looked at her intently and said that she had said herself earlier that they should not create any problems before visiting the palace. She sighed heavily and said that then they would leave them. A moment later, the men ran away. The Duke sighed heavily and timidly thanked them for their help. He said with a smile that, thanks to them, he escaped danger, and he wanted to repay them for it. Decker asked the young man if he could recommend a decent and cheap inn instead of paying. Decker understood perfectly well that otherwise he and his friends would have to spend the night on the street, because the capital has expensive hotels. Aisha said that there were few of them, and they could fit in one room, if only there was a place to wash. The Duke smiled and said that he would lead them, and that she should follow him. Lionel asked the gentleman in surprise if he had really been with the young lady at the time, since he had returned very late. The Duke said that with his help they entered the palace, having washed themselves in their hotel. He said that she should have been called the leader of the beggars. The young man was shocked, because she defeated the bandits with her bare hands. The Duke said that the mercenaries that the Empress would send would have a hard time. Lionel thought for a moment, and said that this was a very important advantage. The Duke said that the lady would not betray him as long as her land was at stake, and that she would not fall in love or pester him. He offered her to stay with him in the mansion, but she said that she would be uncomfortable and returned to the hotel. The Duke said that she was very careful and did not claim a place next to him. At the same time, the young lady returned to her subordinates and reported everything. Decker was shocked and shouted that it was very dangerous, because they would try to use her as a shield against the prince's conspirators. She sighed heavily and said indifferently that she didn't care. He was shocked and shouted that her life depended on it. Aisha said that if, in this way, she could save her lands, she was ready to sell herself even 100 times. She smiled and said she thought she had set a good price. She smiled and, looking at the contract, said that with this money, no one would die of hunger or freeze in the winter. She smiled a gentle smile and said that they would be able to heal the wounded and sow the fields for a rich harvest. She smiled and said that he should imagine landscapes where deserted plains are covered with golden ears of corn. She looked at him intently and asked if he would have made a different choice in her place. The young people froze for a moment, as they understood that she had done everything correctly, and they would have done the same. Decker asked her when their ceremony would take place. She said it was very fortunate that the wedding ceremonies were shortened, and after the formal marriage vows she could leave. They asked her how long the marriage vow would last. Considering that this was an imperial family, it would take several months. They said that as long as they were here, there would be famine on their lands. The lady looked at the Duke intently and asked when they could leave. She looked hopefully at the Duke and asked if they could leave next week or the week after. After all, this wedding ceremony seemed strange to him from the very beginning. The Duke asked why she was in such a hurry, and he also wanted to know if she had a lover. The young lady was a little surprised and taken aback by his question. A moment later, she said that her people were waiting for her return. The Duke was a little surprised, but still said that they would try to finish everything as soon as possible. The Duke said that they would select a number from what was available, and the young lady in turn agreed. The Duke looked hard at Madame and said that they would begin with this. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. But a moment later, she brought up what it was all about. It was cleaning and polishing. The lady was shocked, as she was not used to this kind of thing. They constantly asked what she washed her hair with and whether she used scented water or oils. They wanted to know if she wore corsets, as it was the first time they had seen such a beautiful waist. The maids admired her and also made comments. The young lady, in turn, was shocked, as she was not at all accustomed to such a life. Some time later, the Duke sat quietly and studied the documents, but suddenly heard some noise. He froze in shock for a moment when he saw the young lady. Aisha slowly entered the Duke's living room and looked at him intently. The exhausted young lady quietly called out to the Duke. For a moment, he froze, as he was surprised by her appearance. But after a few seconds, he burst into wild laughter. He looked at her intently and said that anyone who saw her now would think that she was a soldier in a defeated army. She said that she lost because he did not allow her to carry a weapon for protection. Madame was a little puzzled, because the lady was too modest for the ceremony. The Duke said with a smile that everything was fine, because he had already prepared something. The Duke looked at Madame intently and asked if she remembered this accessory. The lady was shocked when she saw the small box. The lady was shocked when she saw the necklace of the late Empress Evelina. Madame said that this decoration with a luxurious ruby and diamond is more suitable for a simple outfit. She was surprised, but at the same time glad that the Duke gave away such a treasure. Aisha asked in surprise if it was Reuben. Madame looked at her in surprise and said that it was clear at first glance. The young lady, in turn, looked intently at the jewel, for she knew nothing about jewels. The Duke understood that she was always busy fighting and was not particularly interested in such things. Looking at her, he said that this necklace was worth 100 war horses. She was shocked by this statement. She asked if he meant it was more than 1,000,000. He smiled and nodded in response. The Duke said with a smile that she could consider it a deposit. She knew she could get a lot of war horses by selling him, but she decided that she needed to think about food first. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise, as he was a little puzzled. He asked if she had applied scented oil. She was surprised by such a question, but still answered that everything was correct. Aisha said that the maids had brought oil made from flowers and fruits, but such sweet smells were not quite to her taste. She sighed heavily and said that this was the reason she chose the scent of herbs. He looked at her in surprise, but did not answer. Aisha looked at the Duke with bewilderment and asked if she had done something wrong. He sighed heavily and said that it suited her. He didn't expect her to take this particular scent. Smiling, the Duke said that it seemed that the necklace had finally found its owner. Touching her face, he said with a smile that it suited her very well. As he was leaving, the Duke asked if they would have time to prepare the dress before the ceremony. Madame smiled and said that they would, of course, have time. She thought the Crown Prince's hands would be soft, but unexpectedly they turned out to be the hands of a warrior. She didn't understand why her pulse had quickened so much. A moment later, she touched the necklace and remembered its value. She understood that with his help, she could buy many war horses. A few days later, the wedding ceremony took place in a luxurious hall. At the same time, the guests were whispering, because they knew that the Duke would divorce his wife as soon as he regained his title of heir. Everyone knew that young Lady Cecilia, who was predicted to be Crown Princess, would not sit idle. The lady, in turn, knew that it did not matter what happened next, because she knew the real reason why the Duke was getting married. She knew that this way the imperial family would not be able to interfere in his affairs, and then he would test the candidates for the position of Crown Princess. She understood that among them, there would certainly be those who would refuse to fight for the title. But the young lady knew that she had no reason to do this, for she was in a better position than anyone else. Golden eyes are a symbol of the imperial family. For the wife of a member of the ruling family, this feature will be decisive. She wanted to show everyone today that she was more suitable for the role of Crown Princess than Margrave Pervaz. A moment later, the Emperor, Empress, and High Priest entered the hall. The temple's High Priest, Gabriel Knox, looked intently at everyone present. Everyone whispered mockingly, as they wanted to see the young savage, because they understood that even the best decorations would not help her. Moments later, everyone was in their places. A few seconds later, the man called the prince and the margrave into the hall. Everyone looked intently at the door with sly grins. But a moment later, the young people were taken aback and froze in shock. They were shocked by the appearance of the young lady, and could not believe that she was the very same barbarian princess. Everyone present noticed that she was wearing a necklace that belonged to the empress. Everyone was shocked, because they did not expect that the prince would give her his mother's things. They said that he did it temporarily, in order to throw dust in their eyes. The young lady in turn was burning with rage. A moment later, the high priest, smiling, asked everyone to take their seats. He smiled and said that now the young people would take their wedding vows. The high priest looked at them intently and began to recite a prayer. The young lady was puzzled, as she saw no end to the long speeches. She understood that the people of the capital lived very tiring lives. After a long speech, the high priest smiled and said that they could now exchange rings. The Duke quietly told his wife that when she later sold the ring, she should put it up for auction. He quietly whispered that this way the ring would cost much more than from a jeweler. The young lady looked closely at the ring. She was surprised that he advised her to choose an auction instead of a jeweler's shop. The Duke, in turn, understood that people could not even imagine that the ring was just a stash for the girl. He understood that his wife had an unusual character, and this was quite interesting. The high priest smiled and said that they must now sign the certificate. A moment later, the young people slowly signed the document. A few seconds later, the high priest approached the emperor, who placed his seal on the document. The high priest smiled and said that their marriage was thus recognized by the law of the empire and before the face of the saints. He looked intently at everyone present and said that no one could deny this union. He looked at the emperor and empress and told the young people that they must keep their vows based on respect and love. The duke looked at everyone present with a smile, because at first he agreed to the wedding for the sake of profit, but he was refreshed when he saw their sour grimaces. The high priest said that now the young people must seal their vow with their first kiss as spouses. The young lady looked at the duke in bewilderment. She wondered if they would have to do this. The duke saw that she wanted to get it over with and go home, so he didn't even want to let her go so easily. With the speed of lightning, he pulled his wife towards him and tenderly touched her lips. The young lady was shocked by this, because she did not expect this from him. After a short kiss, the duke looked at the young lady with a grin. But she wanted the victory to be hers, so she bit his lip. He sighed heavily and walked away from his wife. Aisha looked at the duke with a hint of anger and said that he should know Miru. He said with a grin that without such fun, it would be too boring. The high priest sighed heavily and looked away from them sadly. He told the young people that a saint was watching over them from above, so they should keep their thoughts pure. The duke said with a grin to the high priest, something he gave away. The saint will understand the passion of the newlyweds. Aisha told her subordinates that she would like to return home as soon as possible, but she needed to stay. She also said that there were supplies that needed to be delivered urgently, and they also needed to prepare a place for the duke to live. Decker, in turn, was puzzled, because he did not know how to explain everything to people. After a long journey, he returned home with his comrades. The knights followed them in. Everyone looked at the knights intently and in surprise. The woman looked around in surprise because she didn't know who they were. Decker hesitated, not knowing how to answer the question. A moment later, he told the people of the fortress that the lord had married the crown prince. Everyone was surprised and puzzled and asked questions of the young man. They did not understand how he could just silently watch this. Madame was furious because she knew that they were just going to get provisions. But instead, they returned with the crown prince. Decker sighed heavily, not knowing what to say. The young people, in turn, were very worried about the lord, because they were attacked several times along the way. As they returned, they were perplexed, as they did not understand why the prince had assigned his knights to them. But a moment after their short conversation, they were attacked by bandits. With lightning speed, the duke's knights stepped forward and began to protect Aisha's people. The young people were surprised and at the same time puzzled, because the robbers simply ran away. They understood that the duke had foreseen the attack and had therefore sent his knights. Decker sighed heavily, as he understood that their mistress was stuck between two fires. The young people were puzzled, because they understood that everything was exactly like that. Decker looked at his comrades with a smile and said that they should not think about it now. He said that they needed to put the duke's future quarters in order now, since there was only a month left before their arrival. A few days later, at the imperial palace, the duke met with the emperor and his brother. Carlyle looked at his brother with a smirk and said that from now on, he would be the protector of the South. He asked his brother if Togo had any questions for him. The prince was surprised, as he did not understand why he should protect the South. The duke asked his brother in bewilderment why he was saying that. He said that since he was being treated as the heir, he must now fulfill all his previous duties. The duke said that all this time he spent on the battlefield solely for the sake of his duty as the crown prince. The duke said with a grin that he just had to destroy the monsters that appeared several times a year. Looking at his brother, he said with a grin that he would also have to deal with minor conflicts. Carlyle looked at them with a smirk as he realized that they had finally come to some sense of reality. The emperor sighed heavily and said that they could forget about military powers, since he wanted to talk about the requested funds. The duke asked his father if he was talking about a dowry and money for his move. The duke said that everything was true, but in turn, he was surprised that the prince was going to give a dowry and go to foreign lands as a son-in-law. The emperor agreed that his son would take the money for the move, but he wanted to give 50 million Verona per vase. The prince said that it was a huge amount, and they should be grateful that he gave them 1 million. The duke grinned and told his brother not to say such a thing anywhere else, as it was too obvious that he had never been to war. The duke said that they had won a victory over the barbarians after a long and bloody war. This land had been greatly devastated over the years, and much money and time were needed to restore it. The duke looked at his brother with cold fury and anger, and said that he still had a lot to learn. The duke looked at his father's wedding with a grin and told him to guide his son properly. Carlyle looked at his brother with a smirk and said that he had taken on all his work in one part. With lightning speed, he turned around and walked towards the exit. The emperor, in turn, was burning with rage. The prince sat quietly in his place, not uttering a word, but he was trembling with rage. Some time later, the duke, remembering their expressions, laughed, because he understood what they would have to cope with without him. The lady looked at the duke in surprise and asked if military powers were not a great power. The duke smiled and said that this was how it should be from the beginning, because this is the only way the monarch has the right to create troops or declare war. He said that now the prince would have to take responsibility for any defeat, simply because the military command was in his hands. The young lady told the duke that it seemed that they were trying to deprive her of his status as a member of the imperial family. He leaned back and said it was so obvious that even she could tell. He asked if she admired her magnificent husband. She said it must be no different from a gilded hell, and the nerve he had to endure it all without committing suicide was amazing. He sighed heavily and said he couldn't tell if she was complimenting him or cursing him. She said it was sincere praise. He knew that if it had been someone else in her place, something like that would have sounded like empty talk. But when she said it, it didn't sound like sycophancy at all. The Viscount told the Duke that they must have a common goal, but judging from what he heard, his wife knows nothing. The Duke thought for a moment and said that it seemed that they were seeing each other for the first time today. He stayed and asked if they had met yet. Viscount Giles Repelt was his mentor and strategist, and also the one his enemies wanted to destroy the most. The Viscount told the Duke that since he had fallen for the Empress's bait, he had no choice but to change his strategy. The Viscount asked the young lady how much she knew about the Duke. She said that from birth, he became the crown prince, and was also the best knight in the empire. The Viscount said that the Duke was simply a god of war and victory. He showed genius in all types of martial arts. She looked at the Viscount in surprise and asked if the Duke had really received God's blessing. The Viscount said that everything was exactly like that. An oracle descended into the temple and, having grown up, the prince proved that the oracle was real. But in turn, the man was furious, as he was deprived of his status as heir. The Duke looked at the Viscount and told him to calm down a little, because they would turn bad luck into good luck. He was furious because the prince was slandered, allegedly lusting after his own father's concubine. The young lady wondered if this was a false accusation. The Viscount said that the role of the Margrave was incredibly important. She asked what she needed to do. He said that the Empress and the Prince would hinder the Duke at every step, so he wanted her to protect the Duke. She said that she would protect the Duke day and night. The Duke said with a smile that he was able to protect himself, meaning that she, as his wife, should become his shield. The Viscount said that in the imperial family, reputation and duty are valued. From their conversation, she understood that they wanted to increase their power in her lands. The Viscount said that the Empress would persuade or attack her to obtain a divorce. The young lady thought for a moment about the danger. She asked the Duke if he was going to prepare for a rebellion while on her lands. He said that it was possible. He said that while he was on the battlefield and traveling to different places, the Empress had greatly increased her power. The Viscount said that they needed to create a public opinion that would force the Emperor to restore the title of prince. She said that she would take care of herself until she left for her native lands, and then she would not interfere in the Duke's affairs. The Duke said that was what he wanted to tell her, but more importantly, she had to survive. She wondered if he cared about her. The Duke smiled and said that this would create a good picture in the future. Aisha said that everything he needed had to prepare here before he left. He asked with a grin if she was really sorry to give him even a needle. She sighed heavily and said that she was not sorry. It was just that there was nothing on her lands. He told her she didn't need to worry, because he had already written down every little thing on the list of things he would take with him. He smiled and said that if he later stopped liking something, he could simply throw it away, and she, if she wanted, could pick it up. The young lady bowed and thanked him. The Duke was a little surprised, but said nothing. A few days later, before leaving for Privas, the young lady looked at all the supplies in shock. The Duke smiled and asked if she liked everything. She said that she could not even imagine that there would be so much luggage. The Duke smiled and said that it would turn out to be so, and his father was also shocked. She knew that even mere crumbs from the reserves would have greatly enriched her lands, and now she realized that she had made the right choice. A moment later, the Duke said, it was time for them to leave. The citizens of the empire greeted the prince with joy. He threw sweets at them with a smile, and they happily accepted them. Aisha noticed that the Duke was very popular with the average people. She sighed heavily and said that it seemed the Duke loved his subjects. The young man looked at her in surprise and asked if she was being sarcastic now. He said it was a strategy to regain the crown prince's position. He looked at her intently and said that she should get used to it, because she would be accompanying the Duke. The young lady, in turn, glanced sideways at the Duke, who was saying goodbye to the people of the empire. The Duke got into the carriage and sighed heavily, as he was very tired. The Duke asked his assistant where they would hold their next performance. The young man gave him a clear answer. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise and asked why she was looking at him so intently. She sighed heavily and said she simply thought that he and the people who were so happy about his visit were too far apart. He asked in surprise if this was really bad. She understood that he was staging a play to satisfy the expectations of fools. At first glance, this seemed like a deception, but in fact, the performance was beneficial to both sides. Aisha didn't think criticism was needed here. Some time later, they stopped for the night. With lightning speed, the knight gave orders. The young man opened the carriage and said with a smile that their things had also been taken to the tent. The young lady was a little puzzled, because she thought that they would sleep in different tents. She was taken aback and said that she would live separately from the Duke. The Duke, in turn, looked at his wife with a grin. But a moment later, he told the young man that he need not worry, and they would call if necessary. The Duke asked his wife if she absolutely needed her own tent. She knew that she didn't, but she still felt uncomfortable. He said that they were married, so there was no need to drive the servants away in vain. She was surprised, but still agreed. Aisha was puzzled by the situation and wondered if it was so easy for him to share a tent with someone like her. Some time later, they met in the tent. She sighed heavily and said that she was a bit clumsy, so she would appreciate it if he would kindly forgive her. The Duke looked at her with a grin and said that of course he would forgive her. Aisha slowly got out of the carriage. She was a little worried, because she knew that she had been on the battlefield for a long time, so sleeping with men in the open air was not a problem for her. She knew that sleeping in the same tent would be quite natural for a married couple, but she was not like other metropolitan ladies, and she found it funny that she was even thinking about it. When she was little, she fell asleep playing in her brother's room, but when she grew up, the situation where she had to share a room with a man had not yet come. Aisha sighed heavily and wondered what her family would think if they saw her now. Thanks to the fictitious marriage, a lot of goods and money were sent to her homeland, but on the other hand, her homeland could soon become a dangerous place. She understood that now the state of her homeland depended only on her husband. She slowly knelt down and prayed, because she wanted him to protect her lands. A moment later, the young lady remembered her father, who gave his life for her native land. She knew that she was a marquise and had to protect her homeland. She understood that on the one hand, she was weak, since she had made a deal with the Duke. Aisha decided to cool her head a little and throw all her thoughts away, so she plunged into the cold water with lightning speed. A moment later, she slapped herself in the face, because she understood that this was her personal path and choice. Aisha was aware of the fact that it was her duty to accept all the hardships. Meanwhile, the Duke stood behind a tree and watched the young lady in bewilderment. He admired the young lady, as he had never seen a woman go to such a long distance just to wash her face. He looked intently at the smooth surface of the water. He knew that from such a blow to the cheek, his teeth should have flown out. Touching the cold water, he shuddered. He was stunned and wondered if she had really put her face in such icy water, but in turn, he knew that she was a very interesting woman. A moment later, he walked slowly into the tent his head wet. He looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she was seriously going to sleep on the floor. She was surprised by this question, as she did not understand where she was supposed to sleep. Carlyle told the young lady that if she was the type who liked discomfort, he wouldn't stop her. She sighed heavily and said she would sleep on the floor. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that the water was cold because they were already closer to the north. A moment later, the young man slowly undressed in front of his wife. She sighed heavily and said that it would be much colder in the fall. He sighed heavily, as he knew that whether he took off his clothes in front of her or not, she didn't care. He looked at her intently and called out. A moment later, he smiled and asked for forgiveness, saying that he would like her to help him with his clothes, either as a wife or as a faithful assistant. The young lady froze in place for a moment, but after a few seconds, she asked for forgiveness and stood up with lightning speed. She sighed heavily and said that she had not thought about it. With lightning speed, she ran to her husband. Taking the clothes from him, Carlyle froze in place for a moment. Aisha sighed heavily and said that she really hoped that he would generously forgive her, even though she was clumsy. He looked at her intently and said that she could get to work. A moment later, the young lady began to help her husband. He was puzzled, because he had hoped for something else, but she was really focused only on the clothes. He was surprised, because everyone told him that any woman would go for the sight of his body. In fact, he did not know if this was true, since he was always on the battlefield, so he had not yet had the opportunity to undress in front of a woman. A moment later, the young lady said that she had finished all the work and asked him if everything was to his satisfaction. He sighed heavily and said that he was a little uncomfortable, but that it was okay. She looked at him in bewilderment, but he did not answer. Aisha looked at her husband in bewilderment when he lay down on the bed with lightning speed. Aisha was a little puzzled by the situation. Of course, she knew that she couldn't handle it as the maids did, but she wondered if she really had to tell him that to his face. She knew that if their agreed-upon relationship was like this, she would be able to endure everything calmly. She assumed that he had already met many women, so she did not think that someone like her would be interesting to him at all. A moment later, Carlyle asked his wife to put out the fire. He sighed heavily and asked if everything was okay, because he knew that the blanket was very thin. Aisha sighed heavily and said that her previous daily life was to sleep in the cloak on the ground, so this was enough for a luxurious sleep at night. A moment later, the young duke offered to talk to her about her homeland. He said that they would soon arrive at the castle, so he thought that he needed to learn about the castle and the lands in advance. She sighed heavily and asked what exactly he wanted to know. The duke looked closely at the young lady and asked how cold it was in her homeland in the winter. She sighed heavily and said that it was hard for her to say, because she had nothing to compare it to. Judging by the merchants, it was so cold there, as if something might fall off. A moment later, the duke burst into wild laughter at her words. The young lady thought for a moment and wondered if it was aristocratic etiquette that made him laugh at every half sentence. After a few seconds of wild laughter, the duke calmed down and asked if she really knew who had cut off the chieftain's head. She sighed heavily and said that it was true. The duke said that if that was the case, then her skills weren't that bad. Aisha sighed heavily and said that they weren't that bad, but she wasn't as strong as her father. She sighed heavily and said that the numerical superiority was so serious that her father and brothers died in the battle. She reported that the tribe's chief had been on the battlefield for a long period of time, and the magic emanating from the death god's necklace had successfully kept him young. The duke sighed heavily and said that he now understood why it had been given as a trophy. She said that everything was true. He did not give up her native land, which was about to be captured by the barbarian, and he fought to the end. She said that this victory became possible thanks to her father and brothers. The duke sighed heavily and said that it was all true, and it looked like her father was a great knight. The duke knew the fact that his father wanted to kill Amir Pervaz. That's why he was so fixated on him. He knew that those who had been in the castle in the past couldn't last even a year, so they all committed suicide. The young lady sighed heavily and, looking at the duke, said that her father knew perfectly well about the emperor's intentions. But even though he knew that he would die, he still wanted to do at least something. She looked at the duke intently and said that this was the reason why people followed her father, because he was the only one who did not give up and was ready to fight the barbarians. The Duke sighed heavily as he knew that her father was the only lord who had not fled, and in this desperate situation, he knew that the hero was loyal. The Duke was puzzled, for he wished that he and all her brothers were still alive. The Duke knew full well that the man had not run away and had fought his entire life on the battlefield to restore his homeland. He looked closely at the young lady, for he knew that she was the spitting image of her father. He understood that, besides, she dared to fight the emperor himself until she achieved her goal. The Duke assumed that she was even better than her father. Carlyle sighed heavily and said that now they could talk about her brothers. He wanted to know how many she had. But a moment later, he realized that his question remained unanswered. He smiled and called his wife. Sitting up, he noticed that she was already fast asleep. At the same time, there was a commotion in the capital, as the prince shouted to his mother that he could not go to war and fight instead of his brother, because he had never even set foot in such places. The empress looked at her son with a gentle smile and told him not to worry too much. She looked at him with a sly smile and said that she had already thought of everything. A few days later, they successfully reached Pervaz. Carlyle sighed heavily as he looked around the area and said that it was much worse than he had expected. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked if he was talking about the road, and she was puzzled, knowing that the war had been very long. He sighed heavily and said that he was not only talking about the road. The Duke said that they had crossed the border a long time ago, but had still not come across anything worthwhile, since in such a seedy place there was little to be found. He was puzzled, because he understood that all this needed to be restored. He asked how much money she wanted to receive from his father. Aisha sighed heavily and said that she wanted to receive about 500,000 varones for expenses on food, medicine, and reconstruction. The Duke sighed heavily and asked if this was really all she wanted to spend the money on. He asked with a grin, "No, really. She wanted to live for a few years and die without regrets." Aisha sighed heavily, as she knew she was exaggerating when she said such things. The Duke smiled and said that the best thing she could do was to choose him and that she was incredibly lucky. He looked at her with a grin and asked if she really knew how to be sarcastic. She sighed heavily because she understood that he had said everything correctly, because with the allocated money, they could somehow only survive the winter. She was puzzled because she knew that if their situation did not improve by the next winter, many good people would die. Sometime later, they arrived at the castle. She looked closely at her husband and said that they tried to keep it clean, but the castle is not in very good condition, so it may be uncomfortable to be in it. The Duke sighed heavily as he stepped out of the carriage and told her that he had heard about this many times already. She looked closely after him because she knew that he was on the battlefield with the young bred, so he would hardly be picky. She understood that during the entire long journey, he had never complained. Decker met the young people and greeted them. The young lady greeted her subordinate with a gentle smile after a long separation. A moment later, they walked slowly into the castle. She glanced sideways at everyone present and wondered if they would all be as polite to the Duke. She heard the whispers of her people, for they knew they were supposed to serve the prince, but they did not understand why. After all they had been through, he had come to them. The young lady was alarmed. She looked at the Duke from time to time and wondered if he was thinking that he had come to see her in vain. The Duke sighed heavily and in his calm manner asked his wife where he needed to go. Taken aback, she asked in surprise what he was talking about. Aisha informed the Duke that the entire second floor was at his disposal and that his entourage and guests could be there. The Duke looked at her sideways and said that usually only the boss used the second floor. He asked if she was really giving him the entire floor. She sighed heavily and said that she was okay with the first floor. A moment later, the Duke told his subordinate to bring all the things to the second floor. Decker walked up to the young lady with lightning speed and, hugging her with a smile, asked if she wanted to see her room on the first floor. He smiled and said that the maid had been very worried. She looked at him in surprise and with a soft smile asked what he meant by that. He smiled and said that the war was over, which meant they should treat her as the leader. She talked to her friend for a while with a happy smile. The Duke, in turn, looked closely at the young people. He noticed that she had not smiled at him like that before. When the young lady saw her room, she laughed. She smiled and asked what it was. The young man looked at her in surprise and asked if she didn't like it. Smiling, she asked if he had done it. Aisha sighed heavily and said that he should explain what it was. The young man sighed heavily and said that he had heard that they slept on such beds in the palace in the capital, so he tried to make something similar. Aisha smiled and told her friend that he had made the bed very beautiful because he had never seen anything like it before. She knew that for them, Pervaz and the capital were different from each other. Aisha thanked Basti with a smile, because thanks to him, she could use a luxurious bed that was not even on sale. Basti looked at her intently and asked if she liked the bed. She said with a smile that of course she liked everything, although they were very awkward, and she could also live in a room decorated with flowers. She knew that in her native land, flowers were a symbol of the end of the war, and most likely, the maid did this for her. Aisha looked at the headmaid with a smile and thanked her for her good work. Della Ellie said that the bouquet was missing a lot, but she was glad that she liked everything. Decker said that Mr. Ramir had a hard time, and the butler's position was now vacant. Aisha said that all this time, the main maid had been doing his job. She understood that she had to find the butler as soon as possible. Aisha looked closely at everyone present and said that rumors that the Duke had come to them had already spread, so more people needed to be found. Della told the lady to leave such assignments to her, since she had many connections after all. Aisha remembered what happened recently and realized that this could cause problems. Looking at the headmaid, she asked if she could recommend anyone. Della said she's already picked someone. A moment later, she told Nina to come in. Nina looked at everyone present with a smile and greeted them. Della said that the girl would take care of cleaning, food, clothes, and also help the young lady with her hair and bath. Aisha said that she understood everything and also told Nina with a smile that she was counting on her. Aisha looked closely at the young people and said that they had all worked hard, so they could now go and rest. Aisha asked Della and Decker to stay. Aisha looked at them closely and said that there would be a lot of work tomorrow because they would be provided with the necessary things. She knew that, unfortunately, there might be disagreements between their people and the Duke's people. Aisha looked at them intently and said that she was not going to ask her people to endure everything in silence, because she had made a good deal, not a slave contract. She looked at them intently and said that everything would definitely be taken care of, and they should do everything possible to restore their homeland. The next day, everyone was busy unloading things. The Duke looked at his subordinate and said that the amount he had given to those who had gone to Pervaz was previously calculated for a month. He was surprised that they didn't spend anything. He thought for a moment and remembered the young lady. She looked like a bandit, but still she was capable of such emotions. The Duke was a little alarmed, as he did not know who that man was to her, since she had not communicated with him formally. The Duke sighed heavily and said that even though they had united with the Marquise, it was possible that she might betray him. He looked closely at his subordinate and told him to find out everything about the important personalities of Pervaz. Carlyle told his subordinate to find out about the big guy who was hanging around the Marchioness as an assistant. Lionel asked the Duke if he really meant Decker Donovan, because he knew something about the young man. He was the eldest son of the Donovan family, who was chosen by Emir Pervaz as a vassal. He was also mentioned as a candidate for marriage to Asha Pervaz. Carlyle, with a hint of irritation in his voice, said that the young man must have been a good fit with his ridiculously large size. At the same time, the high priest was sitting in the temple and praying. A moment later, he turned around, as someone's footsteps had already come out, and he asked the Empress with a smile how she was doing. The Empress smiled and said that she was doing well. A moment later, she sat down next to her high priest and said that she wanted to tell him something about the future of the empire. She also asked him if she had a little time. He smiled and said it was an honor, and he would be happy to listen to her. A week after the supply was delivered from the capital, Pervaz's situation improved surprisingly quickly. The common people greeted their mistress with joy. Aisha looked at the people with a joyful smile and said that they did not need to get up, because it was hard for them. Aisha was glad because she knew that the treatment center would not be a problem at this time. A moment later, she walked up to Decker and asked with a smile how the hand was going. Decker said with a smile that the distribution was going quite well, since everyone who accepted was satisfied with their share. She smiled and said that it was all because of him, that he distributed everything evenly. He sighed heavily and, looking at her, said that it looked like she hadn't slept all night because she had been setting the dietary standards. She sighed heavily and asked with a smile if they were distributing flour today. He said that he was distributing flour, salt, and yeast today because the acute hunger was now resolved, so from now on they could allow them to eat bread. She smiled and said that from tomorrow evening the smell of bread would be everywhere. Decker smiled and said that it was true. All the stoves had been repaired for this purpose. She smiled and asked if there was anything missing. Decker smiled and said that there was nothing from what was delivered, but tomorrow they would receive a request for Semina's ration. Decker said with a happy smile that there had been no crops for a long time, so they had a lot of work ahead of them. The young lady, in turn, was very happy because she understood that they could finally grow food in the fields. She was glad that she was able to see such a sight before she died. Aisha understood that her native land had to be restored. A moment later, the young man called his mistress with a joyful smile. He smiled and said that she should hurry to the workshop, as the logs had arrived. Aisha smiled and told her friend that she would leave the rest to him. A moment later, she approached the provisions and froze for a moment in surprise. The young man smiled and said that he had heard that it was all surplus lumber, because the Duke had bought everything in the Northern Territories. He had heard that the logs were very fire-resistant, so they did not catch fire. The young lady was shocked. She couldn't believe what she saw and wondered when he managed to buy everything. She understood that he didn't have too much time and wondered if he really bought the forest in the capital. She was puzzled because she could never have thought that such a price could be obtained just because of a minor contract. She did not know what he wanted from her, but she wanted to do everything he would tell her because he fulfilled her cherished dream. Moments later, a young man approached the marquise and called her. She turned around and looked at him in bewilderment, but he informed her that the Duke was looking for her. After some time, the young lady came to the Duke for an audience. He looked at her intently and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. The Duke asked his wife if things were going well. Aisha said that, thanks to his grace, things were going much better than she thought, so she thanked him with sincerity. The Duke smiled and said that he had a lot of money and supplies, but unfortunately he did not know what and how much was needed, so he called her. The young lady was taken aback and asked for forgiveness, because she should have told him about it earlier. She was surprised, because she never thought that he would be interested in learning about the reconstruction. She understood that if he had not been interested, he would not have spent so much money. The Duke looked at his wife in bewilderment, as he expected an answer. The young lady said in a hurry that she would now bring him the reconstruction plan and the budget distribution report. The Duke was a little surprised. With lightning speed, the young lady hurried to the door and said that she would do everything now, and therefore he must wait a little. Carlyle rose from his chair and called to the young lady to wait, but it was all in vain, for she ran away very quickly. He froze for a moment in surprise, as he expected something a little different. The young man looked intently at the Duke's, and sighing heavily, I asked what he had said earlier. He told his master that the Marquise was not the kind of person who would simply pump money out of him. The Duke, in turn, was a little puzzled, because he understood that his wife could simply ask for as much money as she wanted, but he did not understand why she continued to act in her own way. He thought for a moment about the theft of money. It was so common that he took it for granted. He realized that they could create a kind of double-entry bookkeeping. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed like a carefully prepared plan. The Duke asked his subordinate if he was sure of his words. A moment later, the Marquise entered and shouted in a hurry that she had brought documents. Aisha handed the documents to the Duke with lightning speed and said that she had prepared a plan to use the materials provided in kind. She explained everything to him in great detail. The Duke in turn looked closely at the documents. He was shocked, because he saw that she had not seriously stolen anything. He noticed that all the plans were perfectly thought out. A moment later, the Duke said with surprise in his voice that the plan was perfect. She looked at him in surprise, but still thanked him. He looked at her closely and asked if she had left anything for herself. Aisha looked at the Duke in bewilderment and asked what he was talking about. The Duke, with an embarrassed look on his face, shouted and asked if she had left money to replenish her account. Aisha looked at him in surprise and asked what this had to do with the restoration of his estate. The Duke asked if she had already decided to use the necklace and engagement ring he had given her. She smiled and said that, of course, she had already decided to use everything. When they divorced in the quietest way, she would immediately sell them at auction, and with the proceeds, she planned to train the cavalry troops. Aisha said that she heard that there were many cavalrymen among the Duke's knights, so she would be glad to receive any advice. The Duke smiled and said that it was still a little early for that. A moment later, he sighed heavily and said that he just wanted to know the situation, and now she could return to her duties. She sighed heavily and said that she understood and was now leaving. Having bowed, she slowly left. The Duke was shocked, because he did not think that she had already planned to deal with the wedding gifts. Lionel looked at his master in surprise and asked if he really felt sorry. The Duke hastily shouted at his subordinate that he was talking nonsense. He realized that he had previously given her a necklace that was highly coveted in society, but for her it was completely useless. He, in turn, wondered if the necklace was really cursed, since the previous owners did not live long. He sighed heavily, because he knew that it would be even better if she simply sold him. At the mere mention of this necklace, which is a memory of his mother, the faces of all those present were filled with pity. He sighed heavily, as he was already tired of this pretense. He knew that it would be better if this necklace simply disappeared. The Duke sighed heavily and asked his subordinate how things were currently going in the imperial palace. The high priest looked closely at the empress and said that only God could hear them here, so she could feel free to speak out. She looked at the high priest intently and asked what he would say if Carlisle became emperor. She assured the high priest that their future and the future empire would be bleak, as the prince had committed countless murders since his youth. He said that the people of the empire would become further and further from God's grace every day, and this was a very serious matter. And moreover, those who were born with God's blessing were the first to break God's word. The empress looked closely at the high priest and said that he was the kind of person that everyone would listen to, and he should come forward from the shadows and speak out all his thoughts. The empress looked closely at the high priest and asked him to support her and her son. He sighed heavily and said that, of course, he would really like to help her, but for that he needed to promise something. The empress looked at the young man with hope and asked what exactly she needed to do. The high priest said that if the prince ascended the throne, they should turn this empire into a holy empire. The empress froze for a moment, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He said that this meant that the law in the empire must have a holy book, for this was the only way for the empire to distinguish itself from the surrounding barbarian countries. The empress, in turn, was a little puzzled by his words, but a moment later she said that she also thought that they should follow God's words and rules. She thought for a moment and said, "As for the establishment of the sacred empire, this is a difficult matter, and she must think about it carefully." A moment later, she said goodbye to the high priest, and he said goodbye to her with a smile, but in turn, he watched the empress closely. At the same time, the Duke and his assistant were training. Lionel sighed heavily and said that he lost this time. The Duke smiled and told his subordinate that his skills had improved, so he didn't need to be discouraged. Lionel looked at the gentleman intently and said that he had never even thought about trying to defeat him. The Duke smiled and told the young man that he should be patient and everything would work out. The Duke sighed heavily and said that even though this northern part of summer was still summer, it was quite hot now. A moment later, the Duke slowly began to remove his shirt. After a few seconds, he poured some water on himself to cool down in such hot weather. Lionel looked at the gentleman intently and said that the Marquise was trying to revive the farming of the estate, but he understood that they were in a great hurry with this, and they thought that it was enough to just plow the field a few times. The Duke smiled and said that it was all true, because when they threw the seeds of the harvest, their faces were full of emotions. Lionel looked at the gentleman in surprise and asked how he knew about it. The Duke fell silent for a moment and remembered his wife, who was happily looking at the harvest. The Duke smiled and told his subordinate that if he looked closely, he would understand for himself. Lionel looked at the gentleman with bewilderment, as he had not seen his soft smile before. The Duke asked the young man if all the luggage they had brought from the capital had been unpacked. Lionel sighed heavily and said that they had almost sorted everything out. Lionel looked at the gentleman intently and said that, however, he had some concerns. The Duke looked at the young man in bewilderment and asked what he was talking about. Lionel woke up and said that the relationship of their servants to the servants of the castle was a little complicated, and he thought that the Marquise would be disappointed to learn about it. The Duke said he had told his servants to only walk on their territory. Carlyle told his subordinate to take care of the nobles in the capital quickly, because no one knew what they would decide to do while they were out of his sight. The young man sighed heavily and thought, but he understood that it was worth settling the first issue a little later. Nina was slowly going about her business when suddenly the maid stopped her. With lightning speed, she turned around and asked the maid if she had done something wrong. The maid looked at Nina with fury because she was asking about something obvious. She shouted at the girl, something crossed her path. Nina looked at the maid with bewilderment and asked what she meant, since she was just going her own way. The maid looked at the girl with fury and asked if there really was no ranking system in their castle. She was furious because it meant that everyone in the castle was the same. She said angrily that she was Pervaz's maid. She screamed that she was the maid of His Highness the Prince. She asked with fury who was taller. Nina, trembling with fear, said that it seemed to be her. The maid angrily asked the girl if she would deign to explain why she had crossed the path of someone who was above her. Nina bowed and asked for forgiveness, because it all happened because of her ignorance. The maid looked at the girl with cold casualness and said that she must be careful in future. As she left, the maid said that the same thing applies to that woman, because they are above them. Nina was furious, because she understood that she could have been deservedly insulted, but she did not understand how a servant could insult her mistress. Nina was upset, because she knew that her mistress ended a terrible war, and she was not just a marquise, but a hero for all the residents. Della looked at Nina and asked what she was doing here. Nina was legitimized because she did not expect to see the head maid. With tears in her eyes, she looked at the head maid and began to explain everything, because the Duke's servant dared to put herself above their mistress. The head maid looked at the maid intently and said that the most important thing now is to succeed in the future. Depending on this, the level of attitude towards them and the mistress will change. She said that if they lacked in anything, they should bow their heads before them and learn from them. Della looked at the maid intently and said that they needed to show them that they were superior to them in another way. Nina sighed heavily and, wiping away her tears, agreed to the head maid. A moment later, she bowed and asked forgiveness for showing herself in the form required by the war. The head maid looked closely at the young maids, but did not answer. Some time later, the head maid came to see Decker. He looked at her in surprise and asked what had happened. The head maid said that she had recently heard that His Highness's maid had insulted her mistress in Nina's presence. Decker looked angrily at the head maid and asked what she was talking about. Madame sighed heavily and said that several servants had already approached her with this complaint. She was puzzled, because it was only the first day. Madame sighed heavily and said, puzzled, that she was telling him now because worse things could happen in the future. She said that they could not pretend that nothing had happened. A moment later, the young man said that he would immediately report everything to the lady. Madame said she didn't think His Highness would just watch if she told him. Some time later, the Duke was informed that the Marchioness had asked him for an audience. The Duke greeted the Marquise with a smile and said that it seemed she had something to tell him. He looked at her in surprise and asked what happened, because she looked very upset and angry. She looked at him intently and said threateningly that she wanted to ask him something. He said that she could ask the question. He saw that she was very serious and wondered if she wanted to ask for additional supplies. Aisha looked at the Duke intently and asked him to take care of the subordinates he had brought from the capital, as his people continued to quarrel with hers, and she really hoped that he would take care to avoid unnecessary trouble in the future. He was surprised and at the same time puzzled, because he knew that even when she was insulted, she did not react, but now she reacted very violently. He said with a grin that he did not think that his servants said anything bad. Aisha looked at the Duke intently and said that he had made a contract with her and asked if he remembered it. He said that of course he remembered it, because he had faithfully fulfilled all the points in the contract. Aisha looked at the Lord intently and asked if he could bring her the contract. The young man was taken aback but still agreed. A moment later, the Lord brought them the entire contract. Aisha looked at the Duke intently and said that there were also conditions set before the financial support. Then she demanded that he respect the people of Pervaz. Aisha said that she was ready to accept that he would ignore and ridicule her. However, this should not happen to the people. The young lady told the Duke that if the villagers turned against him, his plan would be difficult to carry out. He looked at her with a smirk and asked what if he ignored her warning. Aisha glared at the Duke and said that if he wanted her cooperation, he should be careful with his actions. Aisha said with cold fury that he would be bitten by a wild beast, an antidote for which there is no such thing. Lionel looked at the young lady in shock, as he did not expect this. A moment later, the Duke told his subordinate to gather all the servants they had brought. Some time later, all the servants were gathered. Carlyle looked at everyone present and said that he had been informed that someone had dared to insult his wife. He glanced sideways at his wife and asked if this was true. The young lady froze for a moment, wondering if he had deliberately called her by name to show that he recognized her as his wife. She didn't know if it was true, and it was just her guess. But a moment later, she sighed heavily and said that everything was true. The testimony was given by those who had worked in the castle for a long time. The maids present froze for a moment. The Duke looked at everyone present and said that he thought they remembered the faces of those who said it. The Duke sighed heavily and told the maids that if what they had told his wife was not a lie, then they should point out those who had insulted his wife. Aisha looked closely at the maid and nodded that she should testify now. A moment later, her maids pointed to the Duke's governesses. The Duke sighed heavily and said that those who were pointed out should come forward. The maid looked at the Duke with a smirk, because it seemed to her that he was not taking this issue seriously. She understood that they would not surprise her with anything new. A moment later, the maid looked at her mistress and shouted that it was all a lie, because she had simply taught them some manners. She looked at the lady with fury and asked if this was not too much on Pervaz's part. They shouted that it seemed like the Marquise did this to suppress the spirit of their servants. The young lady froze in shock for a moment. Nina, in turn, trembled with fear. The Duke looked at the maid with a grin and asked who his wife was. The maid looked at the Duke with bewilderment. The Duke looked at her with fury and asked who his wife was. Trembling with fear, the maid said that his wife was a Marquise. She was excited and frightened, as she had previously thought that he would clearly be worried about her words. The Duke looked at everyone present with a grin and said that only he could call her that, and they should address her as Your Highness. He looked at the maid with cold fury and said that, seeing how she dared to interrupt the princess's speech, the accusations of Pervaz's servants did not seem false. The maid was taken aback and began to tremble with fear. A moment later, the Duke called his assistant. The Duke sighed heavily and told his subordinate to treat the servants as criminals who had insulted a member of the imperial family. The young man was taken aback in a way he had not expected. Lionel was surprised and at the same time puzzled by the situation. He said that if they executed them all, they would not have enough manpower. The Duke looked at everyone present with a grin and said that he had not thought of that, and in that case, they could just cut out their tongues. All those present were taken aback and asked the Duke for pardon. Aisha froze in shock when she saw this. A moment later, she sighed heavily and, puzzled, asked the Duke to stop such things. The Duke looked at her in surprise, as he did not understand why she was acting in such a way. She sighed heavily and asked if she had asked to cut out their tongues. The Duke asked in surprise if it wasn't enough to just cut out their tongues. She was puzzled. She told the Duke that she was the link between her people and his, so all she asked for was mutual respect. The Duke said that she was a nobody from the street, and she was his wife, and for insulting the imperial family, they should punish them accordingly. Aisha sighed heavily and said that there were times when she wondered if she was a princess, so they must have felt the same way. And since they said earlier that the estate was short of workers, they wouldn't be able to move until their wounds healed. The Duke sighed heavily and asked what his wife really wanted. Aisha looked intently at everyone present. After some time had passed, she said that she understood that life here might be unsatisfactory, but since they were already living under the same roof, they had to help each other. She looked at everyone present and said that these possessions might seem unseemly and disappointing to them, but they had made great sacrifices to protect their borders from the barbarians. Aisha told the servants not to ignore this and them. The Duke, in turn, looked intently at his wife with a satisfied smile. A moment later, he said that even after committing the crime of insulting the royal family, thanks to the grace of Her Highness the Crown Princess, they managed to save their tongues. A moment later, all the servants bowed very low and thanked the Marquise for her condescension. The Duke looked at everyone present and said that they must not allow this to happen again, because they must take care of the neck and tongue that they had saved today. Aisha sighed heavily. She wanted to leave the gathering as quickly as possible. The Duke came closer to her and asked with a grin if they should have dinner together to celebrate the truce. She looked at him in surprise and asked what kind of reconciliation if they had never quarreled. A moment later, she said that it was time for her to leave, as she had a lot to do. The Duke was puzzled. He did not know what he needed to say to invite his wife to dinner. Some time later, the Empress came to the High Priest and said that she had thought about everything for several days and decided to accept his conditions. The High Priest looked at the Empress with a joyful smile and said that God would be the first to recognize her loyalty. The Empress looked at him intently and asked him to show her the true path. The Empress looked intently at her first interlocutor and said that the Duke had left and the imperial family could not interfere in his affairs, since he was in territories that were not subject to them, and she also tried as much as possible to prevent his marriage with the Marquise. The High Priest smiled and said that the Duke must have wanted to protect that very instrument. He said that the Duke was too arrogant, so an opportunity should appear soon. The Empress looked at the young man with a joyful smile and asked what solution God had sent. The High Priest smiled and told the Empress that she did not need to worry, for she would naturally know when the time came. The beginning of September was very joyful for the civilians, because they were informed that they could harvest at the end of this month or at the beginning of the next. They were eagerly awaiting the harvest of potatoes from their fields. A moment later, they noticed the threatening clouds that were approaching them. Everyone present was alarmed and wondered if the dark cloud was too close to the ground. They noticed its strange color. The old man, trembling with fear, said that he had seen exactly the same cloud many years ago. A moment later, he told everyone that an attack was coming. He shouted with fury that the barbarians were coming to attack them. The man was furious. He shouted that they could not allow the barbarians to destroy their entire crop. They knew they had to hide in my cave and immediately inform the lady. The Duke stared out the window and sighed heavily as he told his subordinate that the castle was already more stable than it had been before. He wondered if it was all because of the resources he had received. Lionel, while sorting through the letters, said that money and resources were certainly important, but the magnificent Marquise played a bigger role. Carlyle sighed heavily and said that he agreed with that, and he thought that the man next to her was just an escort. But he surprised him. Lionel said that not only the young man, but all the people in the estate were in some sense surprising, because they seemed more energetic than the inhabitants of the capital. The Duke said that everything was exactly like that, because the rumors about this place were only speculation and prejudice. Faith, which cannot be found in big cities, existed only in Pervaz. Lionel, while sorting through the letters, told the Duke that he had received a letter from the Count's family. With lightning speed, the Duke opened the letter and read it. He said that it was a very interesting letter. Lionel looked at the gentleman with alarm and asked what had happened. The Duke said that he was now holding in his hands a proof of the loyalty of the Dupré family, which would not allow them to obey, and it was written in the letter that they were sending him to them. Lionel said in surprise that he thought the young lady would change after losing her position as crown princess. The Duke smiled and said that they were alike, expecting him to get divorced in a few years. He said with a grin that the same applies to the head of Valentina Dupré, because the young lady's ambitions are also enormous. Lionel sighed heavily and said that the man was outstanding, not only in appearance, but also in abilities. Lionel, looking at the gentleman, asked if he was thinking about choosing a girl for the role of the crown princess. The Duke thought for a moment, because from appearance to ambition, it was very strange to have such a resemblance to his mother. Lionel said that it seemed that the gentleman had a feeling of a clown for the lady. The Duke was shocked by such a statement. Lionel told the Duke that he danced with her every time at the victory banquets. The Duke shouted that it was all because she was a very necessary person. Lionel sighed heavily and said that everyone thought she liked him. Carlyle, in turn, was perfectly aware of the fact that she did not like him at all, but she liked the position of the crown princess. Carlyle said with a grin that it was all made up, and that he too could only pretend to be in love on a whim. Lionel told the Duke that he couldn't do it. Lionel looked at the gentleman intently and said that he did not even know what it was like to be in love. The Duke did not respond to these words. Looking at the letter, he said that they do not know when exactly the guests from the capital will leave for them. Lionel said that they could be sent something like jewelry or precious antiques. The Duke had a feeling they were going to do something crazy. A moment later, the young men were taken aback as they heard a ringing and noise. He heard a scream, which came from the square as they were attacked. Aisha said that there were fortunately not many enemies, because the lesson had still had an effect. She understood that this was very good, because their numbers were smaller than last time, and their weapons were old. Decker looked at his mistress with concern and asked if they could ask the Duke for help, as now was not the time to worry about their pride. Aisha looked at her subordinate with cold fury and asked if he thought she was trying to protect her pride. The young man bowed low and asked for forgiveness, because he had said something stupid. She smiled softly and said that she didn't blame him, because now was the time for them to act strategically, although it might seem like an attempt to save her pride. She said that if they asked the prince for help when only a few barbarians had come, then most likely their relations would deteriorate. She was well aware of the fact that no matter what order the prince gave them, she could never refuse. A moment later, the young lady shouted that they could stop the barbarians on their own. Aisha shouted that they should report the expedition to the prince and immediately move into battle. The young man said that he understood everything and would do everything immediately. A few minutes later, the maid informed the prince that the marquise was asking for an audience with him. Carlyle looked at his wife with a smile and asked if something urgent had happened. She realized that he had already heard about the attack, but seemed to want to make sure. Aisha looked at the prince intently and said that one of the tribes had invaded the border and she was going to attack the enemy immediately. Carlyle sighed heavily and smiled as he said that he understood her and asked if there was anything he could do to help. Aisha sighed heavily and said that he could help. The Duke smiled and said that she should tell him what his help consisted of. Aisha looked at the Duke intently and said that if she died, he would take over the position of Marquise, and she also said that he should perform the duties of the Marquise. He looked at her in surprise and asked if this was something he could help with. Aisha said that it was exactly like that, and she really hoped that he would help her with all his heart. Carlyle looked closely at his spouse and said that he had the feeling that she already knew that she was going to die. He asked if she had any other wishes. She looked at him intently and said that if he had an heir in the future, she hoped that he would make one of them the head of Pervaz. Carlyle froze in surprise for a moment and looked intently at his wife. A moment later, the young lady bowed and said that she would return after she had destroyed the enemies that threatened this land and the prince's safety. With lightning speed, the Duke rose and said that this was far from romantic. He looked at her intently and asked who would accept them as a couple. The Duke, with the speed of lightning, approached his wife and kissed her tenderly. Aisha froze for a moment in surprise. Carlyle looked at his wife, blessed her, and also wished her victory. The young lady sighed heavily, but said nothing. A moment later, she and her people marched against the barbarians. The Duke, looking intently out the window, asked his subordinate if he had prepared the knights. Lionel sighed heavily and said that he had done everything and they were preparing. Carlyle looked into the distance with a smile and said that he would like to check the skill of the young lady with his own eyes, because they said that the head of the tribal leader was cut off. Aisha looked at her people and gave the command. A moment later, they fired a volley of arrows at the barbarians. She wondered for a moment if they thought they wouldn't have any arrows once they went on the attack. The Duke looked into the distance with a smile, as he realized that the military supplies he had provided were needed sooner than expected. Lionel, in turn, rushed anxiously to the window. They were shocked as they saw the young lady running straight towards the barbarians. The Duke could not stand it and shouted that his wife was a fool. He was in shock and did not understand where she was rushing to, because the chief was heading straight towards her. Lionel looked at the Duke with fear and asked if it would not be better to send their knights right now, because he was very worried that something really serious might happen. The Duke sighed heavily and said that she did not ask him for help because she had someone to rely on. Gritting his teeth, he suggested that his subordinate wait a little and see. He noticed that his wife was fighting with fury on the battlefield. A moment later, Aisha was already close to the chieftain. The man looked at the young lady with a fierce grin, preparing for battle. He looked at her with cold fury and struck. The chief was furious because he did not know who she was. Dodging the blow, the young lady asked if he hadn't heard about her from the Lure tribe. She said with cold fury and a smirk on her face that it looked like he would soon share Rakhmush's fate. A moment later, Aisha dealt a death blow to her opponent, causing him to fall to the ground with a thud. She looked at everyone present with cold fury and shouted for the next person to come to her. A moment later, the next barbarian was already flying towards her. With lightning speed, she repelled the attack and dealt a fatal blow to the enemy. The man, in turn, flew to the ground with a crash. She looked into the distance with a fierce grin as she enjoyed her victory. The Duke looked into the distance and, sighing heavily, said that she was simply crazy. Now he understood why she was not at all interested in any trinkets, because they were of no use in the face of death. Carlyle, in turn, noticed that she not only fought superbly, but also understood tactics. He saw that she dealt with a dangerous enemy in an effective manner. The Duke looked into the distance with a fierce grin, as he really wanted to go out and join the battle. He understood that she did not ask for help, as she wanted him to see this side of her personally. The Duke watched the battle with a grin. Lionel told the Duke that the Marquis's army was not yet strong enough to hold off an entire tribe. He understood that if they were defeated, they would have a lot of problems. The Duke sighed heavily as he thought about this question. A moment later, he said with a grin that such a setup left him no choice. A moment later, he shouted to his subordinate to order the knights to advance, as they would deal with the barbarians. He walked slowly towards the door in a joyful mood, knowing that it would be to his advantage to join his wife and help her win. At the same time, Aisha, with lightning speed, was rushing towards the barbarians and wanted to defeat them. The men were taken aback when they saw the young lady rushing towards them. She looked intently into the distance at the barbarians. Since they did not suspect that Pervez had received reliable support, she saw that their numbers were small. A moment later, she heard the barbarians wanting to send a signal to the rearguard. The young lady was momentarily taken aback by the shock. She was frozen in shock when she saw a whole crowd of barbarians approaching her. She shouted to her knights that they were being attacked from the mountains. Aisha was in shock and could not believe that they had crossed the mountains. Turning around, she was taken aback as she saw a barbarian rushing towards her with a malicious smile. With lightning speed, she managed to dodge and protect herself from the blow. She shouted to her assistant not to let anyone through, and she also said that he should take another young man and several hundred fighters. Decker was taken aback when he asked the young lady if she had gone mad, because he knew that in that case the flank would be broken through, because they did not have more than 500 soldiers. Some time later, the comrades, defending each other's rear, fought fiercely with the barbarians. A moment later, the young man shouted to his mistress that reinforcements were arriving. With lightning speed, the young men turned around and asked what he was talking about. Aisha, in turn, could not believe that those 300 soldiers were removed from guarding the castle. A moment later, she froze in place as she saw the prince and his knights. She looked in surprise at the prince, who approached her with lightning speed and called out in surprise. But turning around, she noticed Varvara, who was rushing towards her. In turn, the young lady dealt with the enemy with lightning speed. Taken aback, she told herself that now was not the time for her to be distracted. She looked closely at her subordinate and said that now the prince would deal with the threat from the mountains, and they would take care of everyone else. Decker said with a satisfied smile that the Duke was surprisingly a good guy. Aisha looked at the enemies with cold fury and asked how they dared to attack from behind. With lightning speed, she rushed into the attack, sweeping away everyone in her path. The barbarians were shocked by her actions. They were scared, because they did not understand where their soldiers came from. A moment later, the man shouted to his comrades that they needed to retreat immediately. The barbarians fled the battlefield with lightning speed. They were shocked, because they thought that the castle would fall in just one day. The young lady, in turn, froze in shock as she saw her enemies retreating in haste. That same night, the wounded were treated in the castle. The young lady looked at everyone present, as she was glad that they were all friendly in such a situation, and she also understood that thanks to the prince's help, they were able to avoid a protracted battle. She looked intently at his special subordinate and said that she had to see the prince. Decker sighed heavily and said that he was glad to see him on the battlefield, but he was a little worried now, as he did not understand why the prince had suddenly taken pity. Aisha said that no matter what, she was still grateful to him for his help. The young man sighed heavily and said that it was true. Aisha smiled and told her subordinate not to worry. Walking towards the principal corridor, she slowly read all the losses. She was a little puzzled, but at the same time glad that they managed to limit the damage. The young lady hurried to the Duke's door, as she did not know how to thank him. But still, she could not stop worrying about how his people would react. She could not do anything about it. A moment later, she entered the room and saw the Duke. He looked at her intently and said that she should sit down, as they had much to talk about. A moment later, the young lady thanked her husband for his great help. The Duke looked closely at his wife and asked if she was going to leave after the greetings. Carlyle asked his wife if she was embarrassed to even have a cup of tea with him. Aisha sighed heavily and said that it was not so. The Marchioness looked at the Duke intently and said that the sooner she greeted him and apologized, the better. The Duke, in turn, said that he preferred to get to the point in the middle of a conversation. He looked away from her and said with a smile that it was more fun this way. He smiled and said that even if she was very busy, she could still have a cup of tea with him. Aisha smiled and said that she was honored. Carlyle said with a soft smile that she didn't need to be so cold. The young lady, in turn, looked closely at the thin cup. She was surprised that it somehow reached their palace without breaking. Moments later, she tasted the tea and froze in surprise. The Duke looked at her timidly and asked if she was angry. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what she was not talking about. The Marchioness looked at the Duke in bewilderment and asked what he was talking about. Carlyle sighed heavily and said that she had not asked him for help, but he had gone anyway. Carlyle looked at the young lady closely and said that the situation had been a little troubling to him, and so he had asked her something like that. While drinking tea, the Marquise told him that it was not so. She did not understand why he asked the man who came to thank her whether she was angry or not. She wondered if this was a hidden criticism of the capital. Aisha sighed heavily and said that she was too arrogant. Then, and if he had not blocked the army attacking from the rear at that time, they would have suffered colossal losses, and rather, she would blame herself to death for not asking him for help. She sighed heavily and said that, of course, everything would have been exactly like that if she had survived. The Duke sighed heavily and said with a smile that she seemed to be always ready to say goodbye to life. She looked at him in surprise and asked if there was a warrior who went into battle without being ready to die. He looked at her hard and said that he didn't do that. She sighed heavily and said that that was what she usually did. The Duke looked at his wife closely and said that he was very surprised when she left a will. He was amazed because she was so open, telling her husband to have an affair with another woman. Carlyle looked closely at his wife and asked if she loved her land so much, it would not be better to hope that her descendants would continue the Marquis' line. She looked closely at her husband and said that she did not have a great desire to have descendants, because anyone could lead it. The Duke was struck by her words. He said that she had been given the honor of ruling after the sacrifices of her brothers and father. He asked if it would not be unfair if foreign descendants took it into their hands. She looked at the Duke intently and asked if the title of Marquis that her father had received was a reward. Looking at the Duke, she said that her father had several options. The first was to commit suicide, and the second was to confront Luer and die. He had no other options. The Duke looked away from her because he could not answer her. She looked at him in surprise and asked what the honor of passing on the title of descendants was, because she could not understand it. However, the young lady really hoped that this place would not be considered a place where people were sent into exile, because the people of the castle were not guilty of anything. She said, looking at the Duke, that they were even performing a noble task of protecting the borders of the empire. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he completely agreed with her. He looked at her intently and said that, frankly, he didn't expect her army to be so strong. The young lady, in turn, was embarrassed by his words. She looked away from him with embarrassed eyes, and he admired her little smile. Aisha looked at her husband and said that if he had not helped her today, she would have gotten into trouble, so she thanked him again for his help. The Duke smiled and said that he was simply doing the obvious thing, because if her army was destroyed, he would have more problems. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and asked if she had anything else. She looked at him in surprise and said that she didn't want to tell him anything else, and also asked if he wanted to tell her anything else. He looked at her in surprise, but said that there was nothing else. With lightning speed, the young lady rose and said that she had raised it and therefore was leaving. She was a little puzzled when she left him, because she thought he would say something at the end. She wondered if he had forgotten. The young lady stood outside the door for a while, wondering if he was really worried about them, and that was why he helped. She sighed heavily, as she knew that this was not the case, and this could just be an attempt to force a debt on her. She knew that she needed to come to her senses and throw all thoughts away. A few days later, at the imperial palace, the empress received news that Pervaz was being attacked by barbarians from the abandoned lands. The prince looked at his mother closely and said that he heard they were wiped out. The empress sighed heavily and said that the Lure people were practically extinct, and it was said that this time small tribes had invaded. The prince sighed heavily, for he knew that barbarians were barbarians, and it did not matter who exactly invaded or what tribe. The empress said with a smile that in any case she was very grateful to them. The prince looked at his mother with alarm and asked why she was grateful to them. He wanted to know if the barbarians had won. She sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, they hadn't succeeded. The prince looked at his mother in bewilderment and asked what she was grateful to them for then. The empress looked at her son in bewilderment and asked with a smile what was bothering him so much. The prince shouted to his mother that she was not in a hurry. He was very scared because he did not know when the monsters would appear. He understood that if they appeared, he would have to leave. He shouted that they needed to get the prince out of there quickly. The empress smiled and told her son not to worry. She had already figured out how to deprive the prince of his power. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The empress, with a fierce and sly grin, said that they could start a new war. Matthias looked at his mother with alarm and asked if she really thought that this would take away Carlyle's strength, because he understood perfectly well that if his brother were to banish him to the barbarians, it would only be to his advantage. The empress said with a grin that while the barbarians were attacking Pervaz, the nobles would not be able to sit still, and most of the supply resources would be cut off, and informants would not be able to visit them. The prince looked at his mother with a joyful smile and said that then his brother would have no choice but to come to the capital. The empress spoke to her thin-voiced son and, squeezing his shoulder, said that he should not be afraid. The empress quietly told her son that even if his brother died and he did not have to go to war, she smiled and said that he would be the only one who could become the crown prince, so no one would dare to send him to war. Matthias was taken aback for a moment and said that the crown prince and emperor were usually biological sons. The empress sighed heavily and said that everything would depend on the situation. She understood perfectly well that the most important thing now was Carlyle's comrades. The empress, with a predatory smile, told her son that his popularity was growing in social circles and they needed to further erase Carlyle's presence. She looked closely at her son and said with a smirk that the high priest would act with them. Sometime later, the high priest received a letter from the empress. He read it with a satisfied smile. The priest looked intently at the high priest and called him. He came closer to the high priest and apologized for the sudden change of meeting place. The high priest looked at him intently and asked if it was his mistake. The high priest smiled and said that it was the fault of the temple leadership, which was compromising with the secular world and oppressing their brotherhood. The young people were furious. They shouted that they were members of the Golden Branch Brotherhood and did not distort the words of God, but the leadership treated them as heretics. The high priest looked at everyone present with a smile and said that they did not need to worry too much about such things. He looked intently at everyone present and said that victory would be theirs. Sometime later, the young lady was in a hurry to meet her husband. She thought that they would not see each other for some time and did not understand what had come over him since that morning. She entered the room in a hurry and asked the Duke if he had called her. Carlyle looked at his wife with a beaming smile and greeted her. He looked at her closely and said with a satisfied smile that he had called her because he thought they should spend time together, since they were a married couple after all. Aisha froze for a moment and wondered if her will about her descendants had really shocked him that much. The Duke looked closely at his wife and asked if she was disgusted by spending time with him. Aisha looked at him in surprise and, taken aback, said that this was not so. Aisha looked at the Duke intently and asked if it was possible that he meant something else. She sighed heavily and said that she could have understood his words differently. He looked at her intently and said that he very much hoped that she would listen carefully to what he was going to say. Aisha looked at the Duke intently and said that he had said earlier that since they were a married couple, they should spend time together. He held her, sighed, and said that several months had passed since he came to her native lands. But, unfortunately, they had never just talked. The Duke looked closely at his wife and said that they were a couple. She sighed heavily and bowed in agreement with him. Carlyle slowly rose to his feet and told his wife that it would be no fun for them to sit still and talk, so they could walk around the castle for a bit. She was surprised, looked at him, but still agreed. Carlyle walked slowly behind his wife. He smiled and said that the work on the second floor had recently been completely completed. The Duke looked at his wife intently and said that the management was lacking. "Ask for forgiveness?" she asked. Hadn't she mentioned this before? Aisha told the Duke that the people who used the castle kept it clean. The Duke said that it was clean, but at the same time empty. A moment later, the young lady reached the second floor and froze in place. Aisha looked around carefully and now clearly understood why the Duke's men were shocked by what they saw. She turned around and looked closely at her husband and informed him that because of the war, there had been no time to properly care for the castle, and what little they had sold or used as firewood to survive the winter. The Duke looked at his wife in surprise from the limit of what she was saying. He was shocked that they used the furniture items as firewood. She sighed heavily and said that the barbarians had set fire to every mountain that had trees on it so that they couldn't get firewood. During the war, things like dressing tables and grandfather clocks were of no use, so they had to use them as firewood. She sighed heavily and said that she felt awkward telling this story in front of him, since he had received the blessing of the god of war. The young lady looked closely at her husband and said that she believed that the man who had also received a blessing from God was her father. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he had no intention of denying it, because if this war were won even after overcoming the 20-fold difference in troops, he would naturally be considered a warrior sent by God. The Duke looked at his wife closely and said that she might not believe him, but he truly respected her father as a knight. Carlyle said that he was very sorry that the first member of the royal family he met on his way was his father. After a few minutes, the Duke turned away and walked off to inspect the castle further. Aisha stared at the Duke. She didn't expect that someone from the same imperial family would say something like that. A moment later, the Duke stopped and said that there was something strange here after all. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. A few seconds later, the Duke said that there was not a single portrait in the hall. Turning around, he asked his wife if there were portraits of her father or her family. She looked at him intently and replied coldly that they had been at war for 28 years. She did not understand where they could find time to paint portraits. The Duke looked at her intently and informed her that it was the artist who spent time painting a portrait, not the model. He understood that she could have set aside half a day a week for such a trifle. She looked at him intently and, asking permission, said that she would like to correct it a little. Aisha, looking at her husband, asked which artist had come to them to paint a portrait, since it was a deadly place. The Duke froze for a moment as he realized what was being said. He sighed heavily and said that perhaps it was unfamiliar to her, but sooner or later she would have to paint it. He said that the portrait should be kept as an imperial record, and that it was also necessary to hang the portrait in this castle. The young lady looked at her husband in surprise and asked at what stage they should do this. He looked at her in surprise, as he was taken aback by her question. The Duke asked his wife in bewilderment how he would remember her later without a portrait. A moment later, the Duke said with a joyful smile that whatever amount of wood it contained, he would never allow it to be used in such a way, because it would remain for future generations. The young lady was shocked because she did not understand what he was even saying. She froze for a moment, looking at the Duke, because she understood that something unforgettable had just happened. Aisha looked closely at the Duke and wondered if he really wanted to remember her and look at her portrait. A moment later, she ran up to the Duke with lightning speed, hiding all her emotions from him, because she knew that it was simply impossible. She knew that the portrait would simply be hung in a remote place. Minister Owen looked at everyone present and said that since he couldn't take up a busy man's time for long, they could hurry up and get today's meeting started. The priests looked at the minister intently and said that several months had passed since the prince had left for Pervaz, and they wanted to do something about it. They understood that the man, born with great blessings, lived his life in the opposite direction. Some knew that he enjoyed female beauty while being far from the temple, lived being depraved and arrogant, and besides, the prince desired his father's mistress. Everyone understood perfectly well that the prince's sins were difficult to wash away. The high priest knew that this was not only the prince's problem. The empire's nobles were generally arrogant and dirty. They only cared about themselves, others, they just trampled. For a little boy, the temple became the only salvation. He thought that with God, everyone was equal. Even God did not dare to rule over people. He was furious, did not understand why people who called themselves nobles rose above others, as if they had the right to do so. He knew very well that the scriptures made no distinction between people based on birth, status, and wealth. He was aware of the fact that the empire was being destroyed by corrupt people. He knew that only building a pure and correct empire in accordance with the will of God would be the only way to fix the empire. The high priest looked at everyone present with a smile and said that they did not have time to list all the sins of the prince. He knew that no matter what, they would create a sacred empire. He looked at everyone present and said that for this, they must help the empress, who agrees with the founding of the Holy Empire. He informed everyone present that they must help Prince Matthias ascend to the throne. The young men understood that the high priest was right, but they did not know how to do it. The high priest said that at the same time as improving the image of His Majesty Matthias, they must eliminate public opinion favorable to Carlisle. The maid looked at her mistress intently and asked if she was having a hard time, as she was puzzled by the fact that Pervaz's people did not take care of the roads. The young lady sighed heavily. She raised that if the crew had not been strong, they would have been in trouble long ago. Helen Dupre looked at her sister and said that she was really crazy because she intended to go to Pervaz. Helen sighed heavily and said mockingly that if he gave it to her and went there, then there would be macaroon, which she liked so much. Unfortunately, there would be no normal contact with people. Cecilia looked at him with cold fury and asked why she needed this at all. She understood perfectly well that all this was necessary for her for one purpose, namely, to become the crown princess. Cecilia said she was trying to get to where she was needed most to become the crown princess. Dylan looked coldly at his sister and said that she was spitting poison. He didn't understand who would like such a toxic woman. She looked at her brother with cold fury, as she knew that he had inherited the family simply because he was born as a son. She was aware of the fact that an heir from birth would not understand the lives of all the other family members. She knew that if he made the prince emperor, he would have no choice but to accept her as empress. The Viscount looked at the gentleman intently and asked if he remembered that Dupre had said that they would send him proof of their loyalty. The Duke said that he remembered it. Rapelt looked at the master intently and informed him that the evidence had just arrived at the castle. The prince looked at his subordinate in surprise and said that he could bring the evidence. A moment later, a young lady entered the room and bowed to greet the Duke. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise. As he did not expect to see her at all, Cecilia looked at the Duke intently and said that as proof of the loyalty expressed in the letter sent by her father, she had come to help restore the prince to his status. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wanted to help him. He received the letter, then thought that perhaps the proof of devotion would be presented by the young lady, but he could never have imagined that she herself would come to him as that very proof. The prince sighed heavily and, looking at the young lady, asked how she was going to help him. Cecilia looked at the prince with a smile and asked if he knew the Dupre family swallowtail. Carlisle looked at her closely and said that after hearing about this, He also asked if this was not the largest pigeon center in the entire western region of the empire. She smiled and said that it was also the fastest way to spread or gather news. Although he said he had heard about it, he actually knew more about them than just heard. Dovetail was famous for raising well-trained homing pigeons, which is one of the reasons why he decided to marry the young lady. He sighed heavily and asked her what she meant by that. The young lady said, with a satisfied smile, that she was one of the most talented managers of Dufray. The prince looked at her in surprise and wondered if the count's daughters had really raised the pigeons themselves. Unfortunately, he still did not believe it. But he knew that if her words were true, then she could really be of great help to him. She looked at the prince intently and said that while he was in Privas, it was very difficult for him to understand the situation in the capital. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wanted to say that she would cover up this flaw. Cecilia looked at the prince and said that this was just words for now. But now she wanted to tell him about the rumors that had spread in the capital recently. He sighed heavily and asked what rumors she was talking about. Cecilia, looking at the prince, said that when comparing His Highness Carlisle and His Highness Matthias, the number of people who neglect the abilities of His Highness Carlisle is taken into account. The prince froze for a moment in shock, wondering if by comparing the two of them, they were belittling him and not his brother. Cecilia sighed heavily and said that they said Prince Matthias was actually a genius of royal research. They said that he was unable to fully demonstrate his abilities due to his brother's persecution. She said that there were rumors that Carlisle had threatened his brother and sent assassins from a young age. There was also a story that, because of this, the young prince was never able to hold a sword in his hands. Lionel was in shock. He did not understand what kind of persecution and assassins were being discussed. The Viscount was furious. He did not understand who had spread such rumors. The young lady sighed heavily and looked at everyone intently as she said, "According to the information from the Swallowtail, this information was spread by the priests of the church." The Duke was taken aback, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. The lady said that His Majesty the Emperor has recently been appointing priests on the recommendation of Her Majesty the Empress, and as a result of their investigation, it was discovered that the influence of the High Priest was becoming much greater. Lionel sighed heavily, as he assumed they would have to assign someone else to him. The Viscount said that they needed to identify the priests who had entered the imperial court. Looking at the gentleman, he said that Dad was known for his conservative and cautious character. He understood that there was something strange in his actions. Carlisle thought about the high priest for a moment. He didn't understand what had suddenly happened to such a man, if he began to behave in such a way. The Duke looked at the young lady closely and thanked her with a smile for such valuable information. The lady bowed and said that her family had always wanted to be on the Duke's side. She looked at him intently, and with a sly smile said that she would never betray him. She smiled predatorily, looking at the Duke, and said that make it so that the greatest power a woman can possess would be in her hands. The Duke rose up, sighed heavily, and said that this was very encouraging. He came closer to her and welcomed her to the castle with a smile. Looking at the young lady, he smiled and said that she might find the castle a little difficult to deal with. He didn't know if she would be okay. She smiled and said that she had come here prepared for something like this. The Duke looked sideways at his subordinate and said that he should give the lady a room on the second floor. The young man was taken aback, but still agreed. Carlisle looked closely at the young lady and said that he would call the owner of this castle, the Marchioness, so that they could talk. The young lady thought for a moment with a joyful smile on her face, because she knew that this was the first time she would meet the Marquise in person. She understood that she had to make her moves correctly. Some time later, the Marchioness entered the Duke's office and asked if he had called her. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked if she had really come to him straight after work. Aisha sighed heavily and said that it was exactly like that, and she came here to manage the Palisade workshop. The Duke looked closely at his wife and apologized for calling her when she was busy, but he just wanted to introduce her to the guests who would be staying in the castle for a while. Cecilia rushed to the Marquise with lightning speed and introduced herself. Aisha looked at the young lady closely, as she now realized that the urgent request to open the gate was because of her. She could not have imagined at all that the young lady would be such a young noblewoman. Aisha looked at the lady closely and said that it must have been difficult for her to get to them, since the road in their territory was not yet repaired. Cecilia said with a smile that she had a clear goal, so she was not afraid of difficulties. But her maid had a hard time, because the carriage was shaking so much that she could not do anything about it. The young lady sighed heavily, as she knew everything very well herself. A moment later, the Marchioness looked at the Duke intently and asked what about the quarters for the young lady. The Duke said that he had decided to set aside one of the guest rooms on the second floor. Cecilia looked at the Marquise with cold fury and wondered if she had decided to ignore her words. Cecilia smiled and said that she was very sorry that she lived on the same floor with the prince, while the chamber and the Marquises were on the first floor. She looked intently at the Marquise and said that she very much hoped that no misunderstandings would arise. The Marchioness sighed heavily and told the young lady that since she was the Duke's guest, he should decide where she should live. She understood perfectly well that the first floor was not suitable for a lady to live on. The Duke looked closely at his wife and asked if she still lived in that empty and Tula room. Aisha said that she never considered it as such, and on the contrary, it seemed to her that his room was too luxurious. The Duke looked at her closely and said that he would send her some of the furniture that had been brought, so she should discuss everything with her maid and decorate the room. Cecilia was momentarily taken aback by their conversation. The Marquise looked closely at her husband and asked why he was behaving like this. The Duke sighed heavily and said that if the young lady's room were better than the Marchioness's, there would be a lot of gossip. The Marquise sighed heavily and said that she had now raised everything. A moment later, she sat up and asked if she could leave, as she had some rather urgent business to attend to. The Duke sighed heavily, but still agreed with her. In a hurry, the Duke shouted and invited his wife to dine together. The Marchioness turned around and informed her husband that she agreed. Cecilia froze in shock on the spot. She understood that they had a contract marriage, but still, the Marquise should have felt something in her presence. She understood that if the Marquise had ears, she should have known that the young lady was a candidate for the crown princess. She understood that the Duke had married her for personal gain, and that they must soon part. But in turn, she was a little puzzled by the situation and wondered if she was right in her assumptions. A moment later, she glanced sideways at the Duke and wondered how she could be so indifferent or even irritating in front of him. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she really wanted to tell him something. She sighed heavily and said that she didn't want to tell him anything. Cecilia was a little alarmed because they seemed strangely friendly to her. She knew they had separate bedrooms, but she didn't see any tension between them. Cecilia was aware of the fact that the problem was with her, and in the future, she needed to prove her abilities and worth. She understood that when the prince began searching for the real crown princess, she should be at the top of the list. At the same time, the Viscount was burning with rage. He did not understand where the young lady had suddenly appeared from. At first, he was very worried about the prince, puzzled because he understood that the young lady was trying to protect her position as the crown princess at any cost. He was aware of the fact that, just like the current empress, the young lady was very greedy. The Viscount understood that the empress must be able to remain calm in her place. He was well aware that he needed to hurry and talk to his daughter as soon as possible. A few days later, the young lady received a letter from her father. She was alarmed because she did not understand why he had sent her a letter. She read the letter slowly and sighed heavily because she realized that she could not disobey her father's words when he called her. Some time later, she was traveling to Pervaz. The young lady understood perfectly well that she had no choice but to go to her father. Her father is Viscount Giles. Rapelt was considered the genius of the century. He had the highest authority in the academy. Thanks to this, the young lady was able to read books freely from a young age. But each time the Viscount told the young lady about her shortcomings, he looked at her with cold fury and said that if a woman presented herself like that, she would not be loved. Every time she heard something like that, she felt like it was unfair. But unfortunately, she couldn't go against her father. At that time, her father quoted famous scientists and constantly criticized her for her stupidity. Bowing her head, she asked her father for forgiveness each time. He sighed heavily and said that such a feminine one is the best. Some time later, the young lady reached the estate. The Viscount looked at his master with a smile and introduced him to his precious daughter. The Viscount smiled and said that he had called her to help with the work. The young lady in turn consoled, as she caught the evil look of her father. A moment later, she meekly greeted the Duke and introduced herself. The Duke looked at the young lady with a tender smile and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. He said with a smile that since the Viscount had called her, he expected a lot from her. She smiled and said that her father had reported that there was a lot of work in the castle, so she had come to help with small errands. The Viscount looked closely at his daughter and said that she was a little better than the boys he taught at the academy. The young lady, in turn, was not delighted with such words of her father, but she did not answer. The Duke, in turn, looked closely at everyone present. He heard that the Viscount was also quite an ambitious man, because as soon as Cecilia arrived at the castle, he immediately called his daughter. The Duke looked at the young lady with a gentle smile and suggested that she rest a little first, because he understood that in order to get to the harsh place, she had to make a lot of effort. He also said that she would have to greet the mistress of the castle. Carlyle looked at the young lady and said that she should wait a little while, because he had just called the Marquise. The young lady was taken aback, because she knew that the Marquise was constantly on the battlefield and killed countless barbarians. She wondered how scary the Marquise looked. She understood perfectly well that she had to be very careful and not to frown or get scared. A moment later, the maid announced that the Marquise had arrived. The young lady, in turn, was taken aback and looked at the Marquise in surprise, as she did not expect to see such a thing. With lightning speed, she approached the Marquise and greeted her with a joyful smile. Aisha looked at the young lady in surprise after she introduced herself. Rapelt looked at the Marquise with a smile and said that this was his daughter. He said that she studied near him, so he called her to the castle. Aisha looked closely at her husband, as she knew that this was all because of him, but still wondered how many more ladies would come to their castle. Aisha looked closely at the young lady and said that she was worried about whether she would be able to cope with life in the palace, since their land was not yet safe. Aisha looked closely at the young lady and told her to stay in the castle as long as possible, but if she still wanted to go outside, she must definitely take an escort with her. Dorothea was surprised by such care, but still thanked the Marquise with a smile. The Duke looked at his wife intently and asked if she would like to dine together that day. The Marchioness looked at the Duke intently and said that she would do as he wished. Carlyle, in turn, was a little saddened, as he realized that she was not at all interested in all the women who came to visit him. He sighed heavily, as he did not like this at all. The Viscount looked at his daughter intently and asked irritably why she addressed the Marquise as Her Highness. He said that she should simply call her the Marquise. The Viscount looked at his daughter with irritation and asked if she really wanted to say by her actions that she was addressing her as the Crown Princess. The young lady sighed heavily, and having collected her thoughts, said that although they had everything according to the contract, His Highness was married to the Marquise, and if she ignored this, it would be difficult to make a good impression on the prince. Viscount, in turn, had no intention of listening to his daughter. He asked her angrily if she really thought he didn't understand what he was saying. He was furious and told his daughter that there was such a thing as power in words. He shouted that if his daughter continued to praise the Marquise in order to look good in the eyes of the prince, then even the prince would recognize this woman as his wife. Rapelt looked sideways at his daughter and said that she must make an impression on the prince during her stay in the castle. The young lady sighed heavily and, without looking up at her father, agreed with him. She sighed heavily, as she knew that when she became the crown princess, she would be able to read any book she wanted with ease. She knew perfectly well that she had to try to do everything in her power. The next day, the young Marchioness greeted the new butler and asked him with a smile to take care of the castle. He looked at her intently and said he would do his best. The young lady looked at the headmaid and asked her to help Samuel even though she was busy. Della said with a smile that she would show him everything and help her. She looked at Samuel closely and asked him with a smile to follow her, as she wanted to show him the room first. Samuel took one last look at the young Marquise and said that they would see each other later. A moment later, the young people said goodbye to the butler. Aisha looked at her assistant with a gentle smile and said that the wind had already become cool, and therefore they should inspect the castle. He smiled and said that they could do so. Some time later, the young people walked slowly around the castle's environs. Aisha glanced sideways at the assistant and asked him if he thought Pervaz was getting better. He smiled and said that of course he was. She thanked him for convincing the new butler to take up the job. Decker smiled and said that he, the man, had made the decision himself. Decker, with a joyful smile, looked around the area and noticed that it was already autumn. He smiled and said that the first harvest would soon begin. The young lady said with a gentle smile that this winter they would be able to stock up on food in case of an emergency. Decker said that next year, and the year after that, they will be able to make money selling their crops. Decker looked at the young lady intently and said that he had something to talk to her about. He looked away from the young lady and stated that he would like to speak with the women who had recently arrived at their castle. Decker looked closely at the young lady as he was worried. Decker wanted to know why they came to their castle. The young lady looked at her assistant in confusion, but informed him that they had come home to help the prince. But it still seemed to her that they were simply competing with each other for the position of crown princess. Decker was very much alarmed and puzzled by her answer. He looked at the young lady intently and cried out. He wanted to know if the young ladies were the prince's mistresses. She was surprised, looked at him, and asked if it looked like they were his mistresses. Decker sighed heavily as he knew that the servants in the castle had eyes and ears. He couldn't believe that the prince had decided to have a mistress right in the castle. Aisha sighed heavily and said that the contract said that she would not care about the prince's decision and actions. She looked at her friend intently and said that they survived thanks to this contract, so they should also keep their promise. A moment later, the young lady sighed heavily and said that everyone knew that the prince loved women, and for this reason, the young ladies had come. Decker, looking at the lady, said that she had to find her happiness. He was puzzled and did not understand what she was going to do after divorcing the prince. Aisha smiled and said that he didn't need to worry about her. Aisha looked at her friend and said with a smile that he was 26 years old, but he had never held a woman's hand before either. Decker was taken aback and shouted that he was seriously worried about her. As she left, she smiled and shook his hand. After a short conversation, they returned back. At the same time, Duke Stoya was listening attentively to their conversation nearby. He was very outraged by her behavior. He looked at the young people for a while, never taking his gaze off them. Carlyle was puzzled and did not understand why he felt so uncomfortable. For a moment, he thought and remembered their last meeting, as last time she acted coldly towards him and the ladies who came to see him. He was alarmed, as she knew him to be a profligate. But in turn, he understood that he did it on purpose, so he did not need to feel unfair. Carlyle was puzzled and wondered what was wrong in faithfully keeping the agreement between them. He remembered her telling her friend that the prince loved women, and so she understood why the young ladies had come to their castle. He thought for a moment how it made him uncomfortable to hear her speak as if she knew everything about him. He sighed heavily as he realized that this was what had pissed him off. He realized that she had been acting like a know-it-all back then. Carlyle knew that even though she was the lord of these lands, she shouldn't act like she knew everything about the prince. He sighed heavily as he did not understand what was happening to him lately. Carlyle was surprised at himself because he even followed the Marchioness. He understood that if his assistant saw something like this, he would laugh. As he left, he glanced sideways at the place where the young lady was sitting with her companion. He was alarmed and wondered if it was true that there was nothing between them. He had previously heard that the young man was being put forward as a contender for the marriage of the Marquise. Carlyle was a little wary, because he knew he would have to keep an eye on the young man. At the same time, in the imperial palace, the young prince was shouting to his mother that they needed to somehow catch Carlyle, because he could be taken away at any moment if the monsters got even bigger. Monsters appeared in the southern part of the empire. The imperial knights naturally tried to take the prince with them. Your request was denied due to unsatisfactory excuses and strong opposition. The empress looked intently at her son and told him to calm down a little. Matthias was puzzled and worried. He did not understand how he was supposed to calm down in this situation. He shouted to his mother that she must be so relaxed because she only had to sit in the imperial palace. Trembling with fear, he screamed that if he died, she would not be safe either. Matthias was in a panic and screamed at his mother to do something immediately. The Empress slowly approached her son and sighed heavily. A moment later, she suspected the maid, and she slowly poured sleeping pills into the glass of wine. The Empress looked at her son with a tender smile and said that he should drink some wine first. The prince, in turn, obediently did what his mother asked. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile if he himself didn't know that his mother was thinking only of him. The Empress said with tenderness in her voice that she would do everything possible to prevent the fact that he would go to war. Matthias looked at his mother and asked if it was true. She smiled tenderly and said that, of course, it was the pure truth. She looked at him with a smile and said that he should rest a little today. At the same time, the prince slowly fell asleep. A moment later, the Empress looked closely at her son, who had fallen asleep sitting up. She ordered her servants to lay the prince on the bed. A moment later, she told her maid to send a message to the high priest that she would soon visit him. Some time later, the Empress arrived at the temple to meet the high priest. The high priest looked at the Empress intently and greeted her with a smile. The Empress smiled and greeted him in return. Gabriel looked closely at the Empress and asked how she had been living lately. She sighed heavily and said that she had been helping her son, who was having a very hard time. The Empress sighed heavily and said in a puzzled tone that the Emperor was too narrow-minded, since he wanted to entrust military power to a man without experience. Gabriel sighed heavily, and looking at the Empress, said that he was well aware that her son almost never took fencing lessons. The Empress looked at the high priest with emotion and said that this was true because her son was in poor health, and he felt very guilty for every life he had ruined. Gabriel said that the prince was born under the star of Aphrodite, god of beauty and love. The Empress said worriedly that this was true and they should make Carlyle leave Pervaz. She shouted that the prince had abandoned his duties and was just sitting and hiding in the castle. The Empress looked closely at the high priest and asked if he knew how to bring the prince back from the barbarian land. Gabriel sighed heavily and said that this was a very difficult problem. A moment later, he asked the Empress, "What about the dissolution of the marriage?" The Empress was excited, looked at him, and asked if this was possible. Gabriel looked at her with a predatory grin and said that they should just make it happen. He said that there were a few cases where the temple could invalidate a marriage. He said that they could break up a marriage when one of the parties deceives the other into marrying, or when the marriage is forced upon one of the parties, when the marriage is fictitious, aimed at money or other dishonest things. A marriage was considered invalid when the parents opposed the marriage, and also when the couple seriously neglected their duties to continue the family line. The Empress, in turn, beamed at his words. Gabriel said with a grin that he thought this would be enough to invalidate the marriage. He looked at the Empress intently and asked if Her Highness the Empress could not revoke the recognition of the imperial family. The Empress said, with a joyful grin, that of course she could do so. She looked at Gabriel intently and said that meeting the high priest made her feel like the dark clouds were dispersing. She smiled and said that in that case, she would immediately contact the spy she had sent to the castle to gather information. Some time later, there was a welcome dinner for the young ladies at the castle. Decker looked at the young lady and quietly whispered that he never thought that there would be such a place in their castle. The young lady, in turn, said that she also never thought of it. She didn't think that a place that could only be used as an execution site could be turned into something like this. The young people looked around the premises with admiration and surprise. Carlyle looked at everyone present and said that now that all the guests were assembled, they could begin dinner. Decker looked at all the food on the table in surprise and asked his mistress what it was all about. Aisha, in turn, was no less surprised. She sighed heavily and said that she didn't know what it was. Aisha thought for a moment and said that she had eaten different meat last time. Cecilia looked at the Marquise with a smile and informed her that she had a turkey in front of her. She also said that if the meat was cooked incorrectly, it would be tough and tasteless, but they could count on the skill of the chef they had brought with them. She looked at the Duke intently and asked if she was telling the truth. He smiled and said that it was true. Dorothea smiled and said that there were probably no bones in the turkey, since he had removed the legs and wings at the same time. The Duke looked intently at the dish, but said nothing. The Marquise, in turn, said that it was not difficult if you knew the structure of the animal's skeleton. She looked at the Duke intently and said that if he had slaughtered people in the war, then there would be no problem with the bird. Everyone present was shocked, even by her words. The Duke, in turn, laughed and said that this was true, and if he had slaughtered people before, then slaughtering a turkey was ridiculously easy. The Duke continued to laugh for some time after the young lady's words. Everyone present was puzzled by this situation. The Marchioness looked at the Duke in surprise and said nothing in response. Decker sighed heavily, because even under the circumstances, their mistress was only concerned with food. The Duke looked at everyone present and said with a grin that it was time for them to start dinner. Lionel looked at the young lady with a smile and said that he had not seen her for a long time. She smiled and said that since she rarely left the estate, they rarely saw each other. Dorothea looked at the young lady and asked how she was doing. Cecilia smiled and said that she was doing well, and also thanked her for her concern. But a moment later, Cecilia asked the young lady with a sly smile why she had come to the castle. Cecilia wanted to know if the young lady had simply come to see the head of the family. Dorothea looked at everyone present and said that her father was too busy with work, so she came to help him with some chores. Cecilia looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if this was true. Cecilia said with a smirk that she thought there would be a lot of secret information that no one could know, so she was worried and wondered if it was okay for the young ladies to know about such things. Dorothea looked at the young lady with a smile and asked what she was talking about. She smiled and said that she was just helping her father with small errands. Rappelt said that when it came to top-secret information, he was more concerned about Lady Cecilia, so he wondered if they could completely trust Dovetail. Cecilia, the young lady, was a little puzzled by these words. She said that her family had sworn allegiance to the prince, and the fact that she had gone so far was proof of this. The Viscount looked at her sideways and said that she might be a disposable card. Decker was taken aback for a moment and was surprised by what the Viscount was saying. The young lady looked sideways at the Viscount and said that his jokes were not very funny. She asked if he did not know of her value in social circles. The Viscount looked at her closely and said that he had heard that she was popular with men. She sighed heavily and said that was a thing of the past. She looked at the Duke intently and said that the Viscount probably knew the reason. The Duke, in turn, continued the meal without saying anything. Decker was taken aback and wondered if she really meant to say that she was the candidate of his bride, the Crown Prince. He was puzzled and shocked, because he knew that the Marquise was sitting here now. Decker quietly told the Marquise not to worry too much. He looked at her in bewilderment, as he saw no reaction. At the same time, the young lady did not pay any attention to their conversations, as she was absorbed in her meal. Decker looked at his mistress with alarm and asked if she was okay. Aisha was taken aback and asked if it was too tasty. Decker sighed heavily. She looked at him in surprise and asked if something had happened. He understood that she had not been present during the conversation. A moment later, the Marquise looked at everyone present in surprise. She froze for a moment as she saw her young ladies engaged in a tense dialogue among themselves. Aisha looked at everyone present, as she thought the young ladies were exchanging compliments. But the atmosphere showed something completely different. A moment later, the young lady was taken aback and asked the Marquise's forgiveness and stated that she had not intended to speak of the Marquise's father. Aisha sighed heavily and told the young lady that she didn't need to worry about her, and they could continue their conversation without any worries. Cecilia asked with a smirk if that was true, as she was curious about something. Cecilia told the Marquise that she had heard that her father was a great warrior, but something like this happened. Aisha looked at the young lady intently and said that her father led the war to victory by killing the enemy general, so he was awarded the title of Marquise for his victory. The young lady looked at the Marquise in bewilderment, because she did not understand why she was so calm. Cecilia knew that the Marquise was surprisingly good at hiding her emotions, but a moment later, she looked at the Marquise closely and wondered if that was true. Cecilia, looking at the Marquise, said that usually it is you who, in the wars in which the imperial family participated, are not given the large grapes of the possible. The Marchioness looked at her in surprise and asked if that was really the case. The lady sighed heavily and said that she had heard that it was usually like that. Aisha said that most likely he was saving up his achievements and received this award for them. The Duke sighed heavily and looking at the stamps, said that he had lost his appetite. He asked his wife if she wanted to eat more, and he also asked her not to treat him and his father the same way. The young lady was a little surprised, but a moment later, Aisha finally agreed. The Marquise, in turn, continued her meal while everyone watched her closely. Cecilia was very surprised, and at the same time puzzled by this situation. The Duke, in turn, looked closely at his wife, wondering if she was really okay. The Duke looked closely at everyone present, because he understood that the young ladies were fighting among themselves for the position of Crown Princess. Unfortunately, everyone knew about it. He looked closely at his wife's subordinate, as even he had guessed what was really going on. But the Duke was surprised and alarmed, because he did not understand why his wife was like this. He wondered if she was not interested in this at all. Of course, he understood that she wasn't clinging to him, and that was very good. But he wondered if they shouldn't pretend to be a married couple in front of strangers. He knew that the contract clearly stated that on paper, she would conscientiously fulfill the role of wife. The Duke looked closely at his wife and asked if she remembered the family portrait they had spoken about earlier. The Marquise was puzzled by his question, as she simply wanted to eat quietly. Taken aback, she looked at her husband and said that she remembered about it. Cecilia looked at the Duke in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. Carlyle smiled and said that since he was a member of the royal family and had already married, a portrait should be painted and sent to the Imperial Archives. A moment later, the Duke said that they should hang one in the castle too, and for a moment, everyone froze in surprise. The Duke looked on his way for a bit and asked if he had chosen an artist here. The young man said that he had already contacted his artist, and someone had accepted the offer, so he would arrive at the castle soon. For some time, the young ladies discussed the artist with smiles. The Marquise froze for a moment after their conversation. Dorothea looked at the Marquise with excitement and said that perhaps she wanted another artist. The Marquise sighed heavily and said that this was not so. She said it was really annoying. The Duke froze in shock for a moment and choked on his water. The Marquise was puzzled because she had to wear a lot of jewelry and clothes, and at the same time, she had to sit for hours. So she did not think it suited her. The Duke sighed heavily and told his wife that it was her duty as a member of the imperial family, so she had to try her best, even if it was unfamiliar to her. She sighed heavily, but still agreed with him. A moment later, the servant informed the Viscount that a message had arrived from the capital. The Viscount froze in his juices as he read the document. He was informed that the idea of annulment had come to them as a way of getting the prince away from the estate, and if they received evidence that the prince and the Marchioness were neglecting their marital duties, the marriage would be annulled. The Viscount looked at the young people with puzzlement, because he understood that if this was true, they would have to prove that they were a real couple. He was shocked and at the same time excited, because he realized that they did not look like a couple at all. Carlyle was puzzled after reading this letter. Lionel informed the prince that the temple's help was absolutely necessary to dissolve the marriage. Lionel said that this must have already been agreed upon with High Priest Gabriel, who was said to have become closer to the Empress recently. Carlyle was very angry, because he had gotten into trouble because of the High Priest. A moment later, the Duke sighed heavily and asked his subordinate if they could go out for some fresh air. Lionel, looking at his master, asked where he would like to go. The Duke sighed heavily and said that they could go and see how the people were harvesting. A moment later, the young people rode out to the field. They noticed that the settlement now looked very lively, and the health of the people had improved compared to the last time. The Duke knew that after the food distribution, the number of deaths had decreased. He was puzzled because he had never thought the situation would be so bad before. The Duke looked at his subordinate intently and said that he had been informed that the young people would like to hold a harvest festival at the end of the month. Lionel looked at his master in surprise and reported that the Marchioness seemed very excited about this. The Duke sighed heavily and with an embarrassed smile said that the Marquise was like a child. Lionel looked around and said that people asked how the harvest festival was usually celebrated. So he told them that on this day one should eat and drink to one's heart's content and dance all day. The Duke asked his subordinate if there was anything else needed for the harvest festival. A moment later, the Marquise rode up to them and asked how they were doing. She was surprised, as she had not expected to see them. The Duke looked at his wife with a smile and asked if he was not her husband. He smiled and said that it was natural that he was looking around, since the first harvest festival was coming up soon. The Marquise was momentarily taken aback by surprise. She thanked him with a sweet smile for thinking so much about her native land. She looked at him intently and informed him that she had not really expected this at all. And the Duke was momentarily taken aback, as it was the first time he had seen her smile so pleasantly, and it was addressed only to him. He looked at her closely and said that he had been informed that the harvest festival would be at the end of this month. She said that it was so, but she had some questions for the Lord. She sighed heavily and said with a gentle smile that perhaps it would not be something as wonderful as in the capital, but she really hoped that everyone would enjoy the holiday. Carlyle smiled, looking at his wife, and said that the most important thing is to drink alcohol, and the rest will come by itself. The Marchioness laughed and said that perhaps it was so. He looked at her intently, as he guessed that she was excited. Otherwise, she would not have laughed so defenselessly in front of him. A few days later, the Marquise was giving her final orders regarding the celebration. The butler smiled and said that he understood everything and would make sure that everything was ready for the celebration. Decker looked at the lady intently and asked if that wasn't too much of her. Aisha looked at her subordinate closely and said that the prince had given them additional support. Decker asked excitedly if it would not have been better to save him and use him for something else. She sighed heavily and said that there was no need to do this, because they needed to leave at least once some good and joyful memory. For a moment, Aisha thought, and memories came flooding back to her, of the time when her father was alive, and they had joyfully celebrated and drank in honor of the holiday. Aisha looked at her father closely and asked excitedly what he wanted to do when the war was over. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed like she still had the strength to ask such a question. The young lady sighed heavily and asked her father if she couldn't at least dream a little, since it was very dark ahead. The Marquis smiled and said that after the war was over, he would like to hold a big harvest festival because, after long and hard work, it would be nice to rest a little. She looked at him in surprise, as she had not expected such a thing. The Marquis looked at the sky with a smile and said that he would like to feel the atmosphere of the holiday, because the holiday is designed to guarantee that there will be no hunger until the next year's harvest. Aisha sighed heavily and said that in this way, they would be able to put in maximum effort next year, and perhaps they would also feel more attached to their land. She wanted her father to be happy, to have his own pleasure in heaven, because she was determined to make his dream come true. At the same time, the young lady stood quietly outside the door. She came to see how prepared the countryside was for the harvest festival. Cecilia thought for a moment, as she realized that the Marquise had a stronger sense of responsibility for the lands than she had assumed. Now she was clearly aware of the fact that the Marquise was very devoted to her family and territory. Cecilia realized that if she had not been a contender for the role of the princess's successor, perhaps they could have understood each other. At the same time, in the imperial palace of Bibiana, Lowry was very nervous because she didn't understand why her plan didn't work. The maid looked at her mistress intently and said in a gentle voice that, unfortunately, children do not come so easily, so she should calm down and not fall into despair. Bibiana Lowry was furious and asked the maid if she really thought her situation was that easy. She was well aware of the fact that it takes time to get pregnant and give birth to a child, but she didn't know what would change during that time. She was furious because she knew that if the prince continued to accumulate power in this way, someone like her would disappear without anyone knowing. The young lady, in turn, wondered how long the empress would use her foolish son to achieve greater power. She understood that the prince was a nobody when there was still a crown prince in the imperial palace. The young lady was furious because she couldn't believe that the empress just took advantage of her. The maid looked at the young lady with fear and asked if she should get some water. Bibiana Lowry sighed heavily and sent the maid away. Bibiana Lowry was puzzled, but at the same time she knew that the emperor loved her, so she had a good chance of winning if she gave birth to a son. But in turn, she was aware of the fact that the empress would not just sit and watch this. Bibiana Lowry was burning with rage and anger. She understood that if the crown prince had not been expelled, they could have kept the empress in check. She sighed heavily as she realized that she had to give birth to a child immediately and do it as soon as possible. Some time later, the prince was walking around the palace and heard the maids talking. The maids were excited. They said that the young lady even broke a vase because she was very irritated by the fact that she could not get pregnant. The prince was momentarily taken aback when he heard talk of a child. He froze in place and wondered if the emperor's mistress really wanted a child. Sometime later, he walked into the room with lightning speed and called his mother with a smile. The empress asked her son what had happened, but she did not tear herself away from the important documents. The prince, with a joyful smile, told his mother that he had discovered something amazing. He would have started telling his mother about what he had heard, but she did not react to his words in any way. She sighed heavily and, asking for forgiveness, said that she had important news. He looked at her in surprise because he did not understand what she was talking about. The empress looked at her son with a grin and said that it seemed that the prince's marriage could soon be annulled. Some time later, in Pervaz, life was in full swing, and everyone was enjoying the harvest festival. The servant looked closely at the marquise and announced that alcohol and meat had arrived. She looked at the young man in surprise and asked if this was the last cart. The young man smiled and said that it was correct. He also said that there was already enough stock, and he thought that the last boxes could be taken as a last resort. The marquise smiled and agreed with him and told him to pass everything on to the chef. The young man agreed with her with a grin and left with lightning speed. Some time later, the young people came to the square to congratulate all the residents. Aisha looked at everyone present and said that today was a very significant day for them. She spoke with joy that in their land, which had been destroyed by barbarian invasions for a long time, the day had come when they would celebrate the harvest again. She looked at everyone present with a gentle smile and said that they should celebrate the holiday with joy and happiness. Aisha said that thanks to the prince's grace, they are able to fully celebrate this significant day today, which will last today and tomorrow. Sometime later, all the citizens were happily celebrating and rejoicing. The marquise looked closely at her maids and told them to continue serving food, as she wanted there to be plenty of everything. A moment later, she froze in place as she heard someone calling her. Decker looked at the marquise with a joyful smile and said that she should go and have a drink with them. She was taken aback and said that she did not have time, but the young man grabbed her hand and said that she had to do it. A moment later, the young lady was sitting at the table, and a few seconds later, she saw a full glass of alcohol in front of her. Decker looked at the lady with a joyful smile and greeted her. The marquise, in turn, smiled tenderly, looking at her friend. She sighed heavily and smiled and told him not to drink too much, because he would feel sick in the morning. He smiled and said that she should stop grumbling and should just drink with him. The young lady thought for a moment. Because it was her first time trying beer, she wondered if it was tasty. A moment later, the marquise finally decided to try the drink. She put the glass down on the table with a bang and sighed heavily, saying that it was not tasty. Decker looked at the lady with a smile and said that she drank only quality wine next to the prince. He asked if she really didn't like beer. Aisha looked at her friend and said that the beer didn't taste good. A moment later, the young man burst into wild laughter at her words, laughing as he said that she was behaving like a little child. A moment later, some young men approached them, looked at the lady intently, and said that she should have a drink with them too. She smiled and agreed, knowing that they had been through a lot together. A moment later, they were drinking and having fun, telling each other different stories. A moment later, the castle's inhabitants also approached the young lady. They all wanted her to drink with them. After some time, the young lady realized that she had had enough. She heard a cry of joy behind her, but, unfortunately, she did not pay any attention to it. A moment later, the young lady asked the mistress where she was going. Aisha sighed heavily and said that she needed some fresh air. She slowly returned to her place and understood that she couldn't drink anymore. She wanted to hide for a while so that no one would find her. She looked into the distance with a smile and gave in to the question of what her friend would say if he found out that she had done something like that. A moment later, she was taken aback as she heard her husband's voice. He sighed heavily and asked what kind of drunkard was sitting behind the pillar. He sighed heavily and, looking at his wife, asked how much she had drunk. Aisha, looking at her husband, said that she was constantly offered a drink, so she gave in to the moment. The Duke approached his wife and, looking into her eyes, asked what if the lord of these lands drinks to such an extent that he loses his mind. He looked at her intently and asked what she would do if she was attacked by the barbarians at such a time. The young lady was taken aback, as she did not expect anything like that. With lightning speed, she rose and asked if the barbarians had really arrived. She shouted that they needed to leave immediately. The Duke was taken aback as he realized he had made a mistake. He said it was not that they had actually invaded. He sighed heavily and said he had made a mistake. A moment later, he pulled his wife closer into his arms and informed her that it was just a joke on his part and that she should calm down. The young lady, in turn, froze for a moment in her husband's arms. A moment later, she pushed her husband away and thanked him. Carlyle sighed heavily and looked at his wife in surprise, because he had just realized that it was difficult to look after a drunk person, since it was impossible to predict his actions. He sighed heavily, and looking at the Marquise, said that there were several things for which one should be grateful. The young lady looked away from him and said that if it weren't for him, she wouldn't have been able to celebrate the Harvest Festival. Carlyle smiled and asked his wife if she was happy with the deal she made with him. Aisha smiled and said that she was happy because he saved her lands and people. She looked at the Duke closely and said that it seemed he was only making losses. He sighed heavily and said that it was true. The Duke smiled and said that if she wanted to help him so much, she should shower him with kisses every day. He said that it was a little offensive to him to see her so cold-blooded every day. The young lady, in turn, sighed heavily, as she had not realized this before. A moment later, she grabbed the Duke by the shoulder, and the Duke was taken aback and wondered if she was going to slap him. But a moment later, the Marquise, with the speed of lightning, came closer to him and kissed her husband. The Duke froze in shock on the spot. He was shocked by everything that was happening and couldn't believe that she did something like that. He wondered if she did it because he only said something about kissing. A moment later, he pulled away from the Marquise tenderly and looked at her with a soft smile. He sighed heavily because she didn't even know how to kiss, but she was very brave. Carlyle looked at his wife in surprise and noticed that she had fallen asleep. He sighed heavily and wondered if he too was drunk on her. With lightning speed, the Duke took his wife in his arms. He realized that it was very difficult for her to prepare for the festival. The Duke looked at his sleeping wife with a gentle smile. He understood that she no longer needed to worry about anything today, so she could rest. The next day, the Marquise woke up with a terrible headache. She was puzzled, because she felt like her stomach was turning inside out. She sighed heavily and told herself that she would not drink so much anymore. A moment later, she was taken aback as she realized that she was not sleeping in her own room. The Duke sighed heavily and asked his wife if she had woken up. He noticed that she did not look very well. Aisha was taken aback and froze in place in surprise, as she did not expect to see the prince. Carlyle asked his wife if she really did not remember anything about yesterday. He still said that she should have known Mara. The young lady, in turn, was frightened. She excitedly asked the Duke what exactly happened yesterday. Aisha, not hearing an answer, froze in shock when she saw what she was wearing. The young Marquise, in turn, was seriously scared, because she did not remember what happened at the celebration. She was frightened and puzzled by everything that was happening. The Duke, in turn, looked intently at his wife, because seeing her so embarrassed, he wanted to make fun of her. In turn, he wondered if she was really the Marchioness who kissed him. He sighed heavily, as he realized that he shouldn't have shocked her as well, since he could see that she was shaking. He slowly extended his hand to her and said that she should let him tell her what happened yesterday. He sighed heavily and said that he felt the presence of strangers near his bedroom and left. He thought for a moment as he remembered their awkward and clumsy kiss, but in turn, he said that he picked her up while she was sleeping, curled up in the corner. Looking away from his wife, he said that nothing particularly terrible had happened yesterday. She took a deep breath and asked if she had really been asleep. The young lady was in shock, as she knew it was a harvest festival, and she had a lot to take care of. She was excited and hoped that all the guests had not run out of food and alcohol. Aisha was excited and screaming that there might have been a fight or a lost child, but the Duke gently stopped her and told her that she didn't need to worry. He looked at her intently and said that nothing of the sort had happened, since the Marquise, his wife, had taken care of everything in advance. The young lady froze for a moment. Carlyle looked at our wife with a gentle smile and said that she did not need to worry, because there was enough alcohol and food and nothing indecent happened. Of course, there were children who got lost, but their parents later found them. She looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if they were upset that their lord was not present. Carlyle asked his wife if she really thought they would do something like that. Carlyle said that she was too drunk, so he took care of everything. The young lady sighed heavily as she understood everything he had told her. He looked at her in surprise and asked if it was true that she was no longer interested in anything. He asked if she would like to ask him why she was wearing such a nightgown and why she was in his bed at all. The young lady was taken aback for a moment and froze in place. She looked at the Duke intently and said that at first he had said that nothing had happened, but she still wanted to ask him again if nothing had happened. She timidly asked why she was wearing such clothes. Carlyle approached his wife and said that he very much hoped that she would fulfill her contract more carefully. Aisha was taken aback and asked what he meant. He looked at her intently and asked what she asked him for. She said that she was on paper, she plays the role of a wife, and then they would carefully divorce. The Duke said that was all true, but before he divorced her, he definitely wanted her to do a good job as a wife on paper. Carlyle looked at his wife closely and said that she must get into the role so well that no matter what his mother found fault with, everything would be unshakable. He sighed heavily and casually said that now, looking at her, it seemed that she was treating this point of the contract rather frivolously. The young lady was surprised. She told him that she had never thought so. He sighed heavily and said that anyone would understand that she was not like his wife, and this was the perfect way to set them up. He looked at the Marquise intently and asked if she thought that was the case. The young lady froze for a moment and wondered when he had started treating her as his wife. Carlyle sighed heavily and smiling, said that either way he thought she was having a hard time, so he decided to help her. Turning around, he said that since he picked her up, they shouldn't start spreading the word that they were a real couple. Carlyle said that she slept in his room last night, so she should not give any more details to others. The young lady was taken aback and embarrassed for a moment. Aisha looked at the Duke intently and said that no one would believe such rumors. He smiled and said that if she were like usual, no one would believe it. But she was drunk yesterday. She sighed heavily and thought for a moment, as she knew that there was a chance that people would believe such rumors. She looked at the Duke and said that she was not sure and did not understand why she should do this. The Duke said that she should and was obliged to do this because his brother was trying to get him out of Pervaz, and the Empress, having listened to the words of her son, was plotting something. Aisha looked closely at her husband and asked what exactly the Empress was planning. Carlyle, looking at his wife, he said that they were asking the temple to annul the marriage document. Carlyle said that if the marriage was declared invalid, he would have to return the money he had invested in the estate and then return to the imperial palace. He said that they were a contractual couple, and there was a real threat of annulment. The young lady was shocked. She didn't understand how the Empress could do this. Carlyle said that now his brother is partially protected and does not go out on the battlefield. The Empress will be in big trouble if her son goes to war and dies. Carlyle sighed heavily and said that if it became known that they had slept together, the Empress would have a hard time using this plan. He knew very well that they had an excellent service to spread the information. Carlyle asked his wife if she could do it. She sighed heavily and said that she agreed. Aisha was well aware of the fact that they would just be pretending. She sighed heavily and said that everyone would be very surprised. Carlyle asked with a smile if it was really that surprising. He sighed heavily and said that if it had been at an imperial banquet, it would not have been unusual to wake up in the same bed with a stranger the next day. But the Marquise froze in shock. Carlyle smiled and said that, in any case, from that day on, they became a little closer as a couple, and now the Empress would not be able to use this trump card and would try to find another way. The young lady, in turn, was well aware that this was nothing compared to the money he had invested in her native lands. Carlyle looked at his wife intently and said that she must understand him correctly. He said with a smirk that no matter how loving he pretended to be, she shouldn't take it seriously. She sighed heavily and said that it wouldn't happen, so he didn't need to worry. As the prince had said, rumors quickly spread throughout the castle, and everyone was only whispering that the lady had spent the night in the prince's room. The maids happily said that it looked like their mistress would really be a princess. The prince's servants were still a little wary of this fact. They assumed that it was a one-night stand, but they still knew that the young people had taken marriage vows. They were worried because they didn't know what would happen to them next. The young people were puzzled by this fact because they understood that they needed to think about it. At the same time, the maid was burning with rage. She did not understand what was happening at all. She screamed that the marquise had pretended to be indifferent, and now she had done something out of the ordinary. Cecilia sighed heavily because she knew that this was true. She said that the marquise had acted nobly. Cecilia was furious because she knew that even at the dinner party recently, the Marchioness did not even look in the prince's direction. The maid looked at her mistress with a joyful smile and asked if it was possible that the marquise had used the old aphrodisiac, because she understood that the prince simply would not have done such a thing. Cecilia sighed heavily and said that she had heard that the prince was also very drunk, and she knew very well that the prince's alcohol was quite strong. She was puzzled and wondered if they had really spent the night together. The maid was taken aback and, sighing heavily, said that she had heard this from the maid who had entered the prince's room yesterday on his orders. She quietly told her mistress that the prince had ordered the maids to change the sleeping marquise's clothes, and she had been changed into a very provocative nightgown. Cecilia sighed heavily and said she didn't think there was anything wrong with dressing up. The maid quietly said that the prince, too, was dressed only in a nightgown, and by the time the maids left, they were in the same bed. The young lady froze for a moment when she heard this. The maid looked closely at her mistress and said that the beta was not too worried, because it was all just playing with fire. The young lady was furious, as this was not part of her plans. Cecilia wondered in anger what the prince was thinking. The maid looked at her mistress intently and said that the prince would never take the marquise as his real wife. She looked at the lady with a smile and said that the only thing the marquise could do that was superior to the young lady was in her fighting skills. Cecilia told Angie that she was both right and wrong. She looked at the lady because she did not understand what she was talking about. Cecilia had no intention of denying the fact that the marquise was a great warrior. She sighed heavily and said that the measure was because of the lord, who was trusted by the people of this territory, and this was something that could not be achieved overnight. Angie was taken aback, as she did not expect to hear such a thing from the lady. Cecilia sighed heavily and said that it didn't mean that the marquise could become the empress. Cecilia. She was aware of the fact that there was a difference between a good lord and a good empress. Cecilia sighed heavily and said that the marquise was inferior to her in the qualities needed by the empress. Cecilia was puzzled and did not understand why the young people spent the night together if they had nothing to do with each other. She assumed that the prince simply sensed a crisis. She was surprised, as she thought he had a weakness for this kind of atmosphere after drinking. Cecilia was burning with anger and fury because she knew that she would be the final winner. Some time later, the Duke gathered his subordinates in his office. The Viscount quietly told the young man that the Duke seemed to be in a good mood now. Lionel asked the Viscount quietly, but in surprise, if that was really what he thought. Lionel looked at the gentleman intently, for it seemed to him that he was the same as before. Lionel looked at the gentleman intently and said that he had heard some very interesting news this morning. The Duke looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The young man timidly asked the gentleman if it was true that he had been with the marquise the previous night. The Duke thought for a moment, but after a few minutes said that it was so. The men were taken aback for a moment, as they did not expect to hear such a thing. Carlyle looked closely at his subordinate and said that he had previously told him that he had heard the news. He wanted to know what he was talking about. The young man sighed heavily and told the master that he had already told him everything. Carlyle said, with a gentle smile, that he hadn't thought that others thought it was interesting news. Lionel looked at the gentleman with alarm and asked if they were very drunk. The Duke smiled and said that they were a little drunk. Lionel looked at the gentleman intently and said that he had said that he was not drunk, but at the same time, he had said that he had been with the marquise the whole night. The Duke looked at his mentor with a smirk and remarked that he was being very selfish, as he had just realized how much of a failure he had been as a son-in-law. Carlyle looked at his friend closely and said with a smile that he was a close friend of his. But he felt a little awkward, explaining in detail what exactly happened in his bedroom. The young man was taken aback and timidly asked the Duke for forgiveness. The Duke looked at them with a smile, because he knew that later, when his mentor left, he would still have to explain the situation to his friend. Carlyle was well aware of the fact that he had asked him directly, which meant that the rumors had already spread far enough. He wondered how much the atmosphere in the castle had changed. Some time later, the holiday came to an end. The Marquise, in turn, supervised the entire process of collecting the festive paraphernalia. By that time, the castle's warehouses were filled with the harvest collected at the expense of taxes. The atmosphere of the castle was very different from before. Some time later, the maid happily told the prince that his wife was asking for an audience. The Duke smiled and told the maid to let the young lady in. Aisha slowly entered the prince's office. He looked at her intently and greeted her. A moment later, the prince could not help but laugh wildly as he noticed that his servant's attitude towards her had changed. He noticed that they had started addressing her as a princess, even though he had not asked them to. The young lady looked away from him with embarrassment and said that it was true, because suddenly their relationship had changed, so she didn't even know what to do. Carlyle smiled and said that was very good. He looked at his wife with a smile and said that it seemed like he had won a few points from the people who worked in the castle. She looked at him in surprise, as she had not expected to hear something like that. Carlyle said that they had been cruel to him before, but now they were smiling, albeit slightly. He said with a smile that he could notice it in the headmaid. The young lady froze for a moment, as she knew that they were all making a noise about how she would soon become empress. Carlyle said with a smile that the guests who came from the capital seemed to find this news interesting, and perhaps rumors would spread through the capital circles once they returned. Aisha looked at the prince specifically and asked if the empress would be deceived if this really happened. He said that although they would doubt it, they had no choice but to believe them as long as they showed that they were maintaining marital relations. Aisha sighed heavily and thought for a moment, as she knew she would have to endure embarrassment. She knew she had another problem, because her maid had started acting strange after the rumors had spread. Lately, the maid had been very worried about her health, so she did different things. Aisha sighed heavily and asked the maid if applying something like that to her face would really improve her health. Nina smiled a radiant smile and said that, of course, this is so, because these are folk remedies, which are known to be beneficial for health. The Marquise was puzzled, since this was the first time she had heard something like this. She understood that since it was all for health, she agreed with it. But to her regret, the adventures of her maid did not end there. The Marquise looked in surprise at the exquisite bath. She wondered if medicinal herbs should be added to the bath. The maid smiled and said that it was a medicine that prevents colds. Even on her hair, the maid applied some thick jelly with a strange smell. In response to the question, Nina said that it was all against headaches. Nina, smiling, said that all this time she had not looked after her mistress properly, and she was very ashamed. Nina smiled and said that she did it as an apology. The Marquise was puzzled by these procedures, but still agreed with the maid. A few days later, the day finally came to paint the portrait. After much preparation, the Marchioness entered the Duke's room. She asked for forgiveness and said that her preparations had taken some time, as she had spent a long time choosing the decorations. Carlyle looked at his wife with a tender smile and said that her maid's skills were very good, because he had managed to forget that his wife was such a beauty. The Marchioness sighed heavily and said that she did what she usually did. She asked her husband if they made her any more beautiful, Carlyle Nosa, and said that the devoted maid who worked so hard would be upset. Hearing such statements, the Marquise looked intently at her husband, for she knew that as far as beauty was concerned, beauty was before her. She understood that if he was drawn next to her, he would overshadow everything and everyone. Meanwhile, in the imperial palace of Bibiana, Lowry bowed and greeted the Empress. The Empress looked at the young lady with a smile and greeted her. Lowry, in turn, was sure that the Empress invited her to tea in order to put her in an awkward position. The Empress looked at the young lady closely and thanked her with a smile for accepting her invitation today. The Empress said with a joyful smile what they had prepared. All the ladies looked at the food with admiration. Lady looked at Lowry intently and said that it was the first time she had seen her on such an occasion, and that it was not at all like a young lady. Lowry froze in place for a moment and looked coldly at everyone present. The lady looked at her intently and said that she had no idea that Lady Lowry would be attending tea with them. Lowry froze in rage as the young lady asked why she had come to them. She caught a hint of sarcasm in her words. Lowry looked at everyone present with a soft smile and said that she always wanted to meet them as noble ladies. Since their age categories were so different, it was difficult. The lady looked at her intently and asked how old she was this year. Lowry looked at everyone present with a satisfied smile and said that she had turned 25. Madame looked at her in surprise and said that she was the same age as her daughter. The young lady was furious and wondered what was wrong with her being with an emperor who was old enough to be her father. Lowry, in turn, looked proudly at everyone present. She understood that if she managed to get pregnant with the emperor's son, they would crawl at her feet. The lady looked at everyone present and said that she had heard that the house of Lady Lowry's parents, Baron Peyton, had been visited by shamans, and that the man was a very famous shaman who could help one have children. She looked closely at the young lady and asked everyone present with a smirk why they thought he was going there. Lowry was well aware of the fact that His Majesty had married her to the Viscount in order to make her his mistress, and the Viscount was 60 years old this year. The young lady was furious, and she knew that if she told the Emperor about the concrete, he would not ignore it, and the Empress who created this situation would be punished. The Empress said with a smile, "Mrs. She shouldn't be so sarcastic after all. They all knew each other, and everyone knew the fact that the young lady was the Emperor's favorite." The Empress smiled and said that the young lady was of course trying to have a child for the Emperor. The Empress looked at the young lady softly and said that the Mrs. had some misunderstanding, and she hoped that the young lady would generously forgive her. The Empress smiled, looking at the lady, and said that if she could help her in any way, then she should tell her about it. Lowry looked at the Empress with a smile and said that, of course, she would tell her. Lowry didn't take her eyes off the Empress. She didn't know if she was being serious about this or if it was a high level of sarcasm. Lowry wondered if the Empress really thought that even if she gave birth to a son, he wouldn't be able to become the crown prince. Lowry looked at everyone present and said with a smile that if the Empress wanted her to be pregnant, it would be the greatest honor and joy for her. Lowry said with a smile that the Emperor really wanted a son from her, so she would do everything possible to achieve this. Lowry looked intently at the Empress, and the Empress, in turn, only smiled sweetly. Some time later, the tea party came to an end, and the Empress sat in her chambers, laughing wildly. The maid was taken aback and looked at her mistress in surprise. The maid looked at the Empress in surprise and asked if something good had happened. After laughing wildly, the Empress calmed down and said that it was not so, but something very interesting had happened. The Empress had shown today that she was not holding back the young lady, and now she was wondering how many she could win over to her side. The Empress, in turn, understood perfectly well that she had to do something else in order to trample the crown prince. Meanwhile, at the castle, the artist greeted the prince and his wife. The Marquise looked at the man closely and greeted him with a smile, saying that she was very glad to meet him. The man smiled and said that today he would just sketch out a few compositions. The Marquise looked at him in surprise and asked if he hadn't decided yet how he would draw. The artist sighed and said that they would need to find a composition that would best suit both of them. Only then would it be possible to reveal the love between them. The young lady was taken aback for a moment and wondered how he was going to reveal something that did not exist, while the Duke stood next to his wife with a satisfied smile. Carlyle looked at his wife intently and said that they must live up to the artist's expectations. Some time later, the young people posed. Aisha sighed heavily, as she was very ashamed and uncomfortable. After some time, the artist said goodbye to the young people and said that they would see each other in a few days. Aisha sighed heavily, as it felt like hours had passed. She was surprised that the sun was still shining. Carlyle sighed heavily, and looking at his wife, asked why she was so devastated when she was just sitting there. After all, only a few hours had passed. Aisha sighed heavily and said that she felt uncomfortable when someone looked at her. The Duke was surprised by such a statement. A moment later, he looked at her tenderly. The Marquise looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand his gaze. He looked at his wife with a smile and said that she was surprisingly shy. Looking away from him, she asked him if he didn't feel uncomfortable when people looked at him like that. Carlyle sighed heavily and said with a smile that he was a man who had been on display for everyone since birth. Aisha was taken aback for a moment. She sighed heavily and said that it must have been difficult. The Duke looked at her hard and said that it wasn't, and he never thought it was difficult. But he thought for a moment and wondered if it wouldn't be convenient to always feel someone's eyes on him. Looking at his wife, and he said that everything was correct, and it must be so. Everything was like that. She looked at him in bewilderment. He looked at her with a tender smile and said that it must have been difficult for him. Aisha looked at her husband in bewilderment, as she did not expect to hear something like that. After a few months, the harvest was over. At the end of November, when preparations for winter were completed, December came, and winter followed. All the inhabitants of the castle were glad that winter had come, and they were also glad that they had firewood and food for the winter. The young lady, in turn, kept a close eye on everyone. She was glad that everyone had enough food. She smiled and said that it was really wonderful, because there were times during the war when she was grateful for the snow, because when it snowed, the war turned into a lull. The Duke sighed heavily and said that perhaps that was the case, but there were also many people who froze to death. The Marquise sighed heavily and, thinking, said that there were many elderly people and children who died. She sighed heavily and said that there was a case where an entire family was found frozen to death, and many people had their arms and legs amputated due to frostbite. The young lady, in turn, trembled with fear, as memories she had wanted to forget came flooding back to her. Carlyle approached his wife and told her to exhale slowly. The young lady was taken aback when she felt her husband's light touch on her body. She sighed heavily as she realized she needed to stop thinking about that time. Aisha said that everything was okay now, because they had survived and were well prepared for the winter. The Marquise looked closely at her husband and said with a tender smile that it was all thanks to him. Aisha confidently said that she doesn't care what price he asks her to pay. She is ready for anything. The Duke sighed heavily and said that perhaps it would be unfair for her to hear this. But in the capital, December was the most interesting month of the year because they could celebrate the end of one year and the beginning of the new year. Aisha looked at him in surprise and asked how they were spending the winter. Turning to him, the Duke said with a smile that he was inviting his close friends and throwing a party. Carlyle said with a smile that she was at the party. There was roast meat and raspberry jam, drinking alcohol with cinnamon. The young lady thought about what was said for a moment. The Duke looked at his wife with a tender smile and said that they also exchanged gifts with each other. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he had prepared a New Year's gift for her. Aisha froze in surprise for a moment. She looked at the small box in surprise and asked what it was. Carlyle smilingly informed the young lady that he had said earlier that it was a gift. He smiled and said that gifts are given in December. He also said that there was no bad meaning in this, so she could safely open the small box with the gift. The young lady, in turn, was a little puzzled, because she had not prepared anything for him. A moment after opening the small box, she froze for a moment as she saw a beautiful necklace. Carlyle asked the Marchioness if she could see the magic stone. She looked at him in surprise and said that of course she could. He smiled and said that in that case she would quickly understand. The Duke slowly approached his wife and began to put the necklace on her beautiful neck. He said that inside the necklace there was a magic stone. The Duke said with a gentle smile that it did not matter much, but one day the stone would save her life. Aisha was taken aback as she understood that it was a very valuable item. The Duke looked at his wife with a tender smile, but said nothing. She smiled and thanked him for such a lovely gift. Carlyle smiled and said that it was not a great loss for the prince. Some time later, the lady was sitting in her room when suddenly a carrier pigeon flew to her. After reading the small note, she learned that there were rumors circulating in social circles that His Highness Carlyle was summoning the demon Karakesh. Unfortunately, this rumor was already beginning to have an impact on the middle-class people. The young lady was shocked and wondered if the prince was really trying to summon devils. She sighed heavily as she didn't know who in their right mind would believe such nonsense. She was furious because she knew it was a big problem, that it was bothering the middle class. She knew she had to report this to the prince immediately. Some time later, the young lady came to the prince, unfortunately, with bad news. Carlyle read the news and froze with rage. Carlyle sighed heavily and wondered if the prince he spoke of in the letter was really him. He looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if he had really summoned the devil. He was shocked by this news and did not understand how he had managed to do such a thing. The young lady sighed heavily and said that he did this with the help of a verse that was in the 4th chapter of the book of Habakkuk. For the demon said that the one who could summon him was the one who had taken 100 lives, and the one who had set fire to 10 temples, the one who had no God to serve. The Duke sighed heavily and asked if it was really necessary to burn 10 temples to summon them. Everyone present was furious because they understood that people were not grateful. They understood that every time the prince won, everyone bowed and praised him, and now they were reading such nonsense. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she thought that these rumors spread quickly because they were provocative, although few people believed them, but his image was inevitably damaged. The Duke sighed heavily and said with a grin that everything was exactly like that. Now he understood what strategy the Empress had chosen, because she had decided to show him as a minion of the devil and her son as an angel. Carlyle sighed heavily and said that even in times like these, his brother, who had always been hiding behind his back, was benefiting from him. The Viscount was furious because he knew that the Empress had continued to send him to the battlefield all this time, which made people not know what kind of man he really was. The Viscount sighed heavily and said that even one such rumor could tarnish the prince's image. Carlyle looked closely at everyone present and asked what they would do with something like that. The Viscount looked at the policeman intently and said that some event was needed to strengthen their support, so that the incident would show that His Highness was an indispensable man. The prince thought for a moment and said that he was indispensable only in war. The Viscount looked at the gentleman intently and said that most people thought exactly that way. The Duke looked at the Viscount in surprise and asked if by this he meant that they would start a war in the south. Lionel was alarmed and wondered if it was possible to start a war deliberately. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he would leave, so that they would start a war under their influence, which they themselves would try to prevent. He sighed heavily and said that this could not be done. The Duke was well aware of the fact that the main task of the Crown Prince is to protect his people. He understood that it was completely unacceptable to subject the people of the Empire to disasters for the sake of power. The Viscount sighed heavily and said that this was true, because he did not really want to deliberately start a war. He said that some incident needed to happen. The Duke said that something like that would be easier to arrange. Carlyle looked at everyone present and said that before they came to the castle, they had cleared the kingdom and nothing would happen for the next few years. The Viscount bowed and said that in that case, they needed to think more about other methods. Gyro sometime, and it was also necessary to study the social atmosphere and check on the High Priest Gabriel. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and said that today he was again indebted to the Swallowtail. Bowing to the lady, she said that helping the prince was the good of her family and a mere trifle. She smiled and said that it was time for her to leave. If they had any news to share with her, she was expecting a call. As the young lady left, she thought for a moment. As the prince was surprisingly weaker, she knew that starting a war would be a good idea. She knew that she shouldn't loosen her grip. She wondered if he had been so concerned about the lives of commoners from the start. She knew that the Viscount needed to concentrate on his role as an assistant. She hoped that the Duke would understand what she meant when she asked him to call her personally. The Duke looked at his subordinate in surprise and asked how much time had passed since the servants were punished. He asked irritably if they had started quarreling again. The young man sighed heavily and said that the services and the knights were different people. The Duke asked anxiously what had happened this time. Early in the morning, young people were clearing snow on the ancient eastern site. The prince's knights looked at Pervaz's men with intent and sidelong glances. A moment later, the knight looked at the young men with a grin and said that they should go to them too, in order to restore order. The man looked at the knight in surprise and asked what he had just said.